When a struggling single father discovers two strangers bleeding in the rain outside his garage, he has no idea that saving them will unlock a billion-dollar secret that could destroy everything he's built or give him the family he never dared to dream of. Welcome to tonight's story that will take you on an emotional roller coaster through love, betrayal, and the power of second chances. Stay with me until the very end to see how this incredible tale unfolds. And please comment below with your city so I can see how far this story has traveled around the world. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of Morrison's garage like bullets from heaven, each drop a percussion in the symphony of Jake's misery. Thunder rolled across the Texas plains, shaking the windows of the small mechanic shop that had become both his livelihood and his prison. It was past midnight on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world, and Jake Morrison sat hunched over a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the pile of unpaid bills scattered across his cluttered desk. "Daddy." The small voice cut through the storm's fury like a knife through his heart. Jake looked up to see his 7-year-old daughter Emma standing in the doorway that connected the garage to their small apartment, above her blonde hair, messy from sleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother. "What are you doing up, sweetheart?" Jake's voice was rough with exhaustion, and something deeper, a weariness that had settled into his bones like rust. "The thunder woke me up," Emma whispered, padding across the oil-stained concrete floor in her bare feet. "And you weren't in your room." Jake pushed back from the desk and opened his arms, and Emma ran into them like she always did, like she had every night since Sarah died 18 months ago. He held her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. "I was just finishing up some work," he lied, glancing at the red-stamped final notice on the electric bill. "Come on, let's get you back to bed." But before he could stand, a sound cut through the storm that made his blood run cold. A woman's scream, raw and desperate, followed by the screech of tires on wet asphalt. Emma pulled back, her blue eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, what was that?" Jake was already moving, setting Emma gently aside and grabbing the flashlight from his workbench. "Stay here, baby. Don't move." He yanked open the garage door, and the storm hit him like a physical blow. Rain lashed his face, soaking through his worn flannel shirt in seconds. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty street, the overflowing gutters. "The Jesus Christ," he breathed. There, collapsed in the gravel just outside his garage, lay a woman and a small boy. The woman was on her side, one arm wrapped protectively around the child, both of them soaked to the bone and motionless. In the stark white beam of his flashlight, Jake could see dark stains on their clothes that weren't from the rain. Blood. For a moment, Jake froze. His mind raced back to that night 18 months ago, when the police had knocked on his door, their faces grim, their words careful and clinical. "There's been an accident, Mr. Morrison. Your wife. I'm sorry." But then the woman moved just a slight shift of her shoulders, and Jake snapped back to the present. "Emma, call 911, he shouted over his shoulder as he ran into the storm. The woman was conscious, but barely, her eyes unfocused and glassy with pain. She looked to be in her late 20s, with long, dark hair plastered to her skull, and a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't swollen and bruised. The boy, he couldn't be more than 5, was unconscious, his small body curled against his mother like a question mark. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake knelt beside them, his knees sinking into the mud. "I'm going to help you, okay? You're safe now." The woman's eyes found his, and for a moment Jake felt something shift inside his chest. Even through the pain and fear, there was something in her gaze, a strength that reminded him of Sarah, a fierce protectiveness that he recognized in his own reflection. My son, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Is he? Jake checked the boy's pulse, steady and strong. He's alive. You both are. I'm Jake Morrison. This is my garage. I'm going to get you inside, okay? She tried to nod, but winced, her hand moving instinctively to her ribs. Jake could see she was fighting to stay conscious, fighting to keep her eyes open. What's your name? He asked gently, lifting the boy into his arms. The child was light, too light, and Jake felt his heart clench. Grace, she managed. Grace Miller. And this is Sam. Jake helped her to her feet, supporting her weight, as they stumbled toward the garage. She was taller than he'd expected, maybe 5'6", and despite her injuries, he could feel the lean strength in her frame. Inside the garage, Emma was standing exactly where he'd left her, the cordless phone pressed to her ear. Yes, we need an ambulance, she was saying in her clear, grown-up voice that broke Jake's heart every time he heard it. My daddy found 2 hurt people outside our garage. Jake eased Grace onto the old couch he kept in the corner, Sarah's idea for when customers had to wait, and laid Sam gently beside her. In the harsh fluorescent light of the garage, their injuries looked even worse. Grace's left eye was swollen shut. Her lip split, her white blouse torn and stained with blood. Sam had a gash on his forehead and bruises on his arms that made Jake's jaw clench with rage. Who did this to you? The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Grace's good eye found his, and for a moment Jake saw something flicker there, not just fear, but calculation, as if she was weighing how much to tell him. We were in a car accident, she said finally. Our car broke down and someone stopped to help, but they... She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Jake had seen enough bar fights and domestic disputes in his 32 years to recognize the handiwork of fists and boots. The ambulance is coming, Emma announced, hanging up the phone. She approached the couch slowly, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. Is the little boy okay? He will be, Jake said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He grabbed a clean shop rag and gently dabbed at the cut on Sam's forehead. Emma, can you get me the first aid kit from the bathroom? As Emma scurried away, Jake knelt beside Grace. Up close, he could see that beneath the bruises and swelling, she was indeed beautiful, high cheekbones, full lips, skin that spoke of good genetics and better living than most folks in Millbrook, Texas could afford. Thank you, she whispered, her uninjured hand reaching out to touch his arm. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Don't worry about it, Jake said gruffly, though her touch sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. Anyone would have done the same. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. Millbrook wasn't exactly known for its good Samaritans, especially not at midnight in a thunderstorm. Emma returned with the first aid kit, and Jake began cleaning Grace's wounds with practiced efficiency. He'd patched up his share of cuts and scrapes over the year's occupational hazard of being both a mechanic and a single father. You're very good at this, Grace observed, wincing as he applied antiseptic to a particularly nasty scrape on her cheek. My wife was a nurse, Jake said without thinking, then immediately wished he could take the words back. He didn't talk about Sarah with strangers. He barely talked about Sarah with people he'd known his whole life. Grace's voice was gentle, understanding. She died. Car accident. 1.5 years ago. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the storm outside and Sam's steady breathing. Jake focused on cleaning Grace's wounds, trying not to think about the sympathy he could feel radiating from her like heat. I'm sorry, she said finally. That must be... I can't imagine. Jake's hands stilled for a moment. Most people, when they learned about Sarah, launched into stories about their own losses or offered platitudes about God's plan and better places. But Grace just sat there, acknowledging his pain without trying to fix it or minimize it, and somehow that meant more than all the casseroles and condolences in the world. "Yeah, well," he said, returning to his work, "life's got a way of kicking you when you're down." "Daddy." Emma's voice was soft but insistent. "The little boy is waking up." Sam's eyes fluttered open, brown eyes Jake noticed several shades lighter than his mother's nearly black ones. The boy looked around in confusion for a moment, before his gaze found Grace and relief flooded his small features. "Mama." His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here, baby," Grace said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." Sam tried to sit up, but Jake gently pressed him back down. "Easy there, sport. You took a pretty good knock on the head. The paramedics are coming to check you out, okay?" Sam's eyes darted between Jake and Emma, wide with uncertainty. "Who are you?" "I'm Jake, and this is my daughter Emma. We found you and your mama outside in the rain." "Are you going to hurt us?" The question was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of the innocence that should have belonged to a 5-year-old, that Jake felt something break inside his chest. "No, son. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Sam studied Jake's face for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "Okay. Mama, I'm thirsty." Emma perked up. "I can get him some water. Or maybe juice. We have apple juice." "Water's fine," Grace said with a small smile, the first Jake had seen from her. "Thank you, Emma." As Emma bustled off to get the water, Jake found himself studying the two strangers who had literally fallen into his life. There was something about them that didn't quite add up. Grace's clothes, despite being torn and bloodstained, were expensive designer, unless he missed his guess. Her speech was educated, refined, lacking the rough edges that came from a lifetime in small-town Texas. And Sam, despite his obvious trauma, had the kind of polished manners that spoke of private schools and country clubs. "Where are you from?" Jake asked as casually as he could manage. Grace hesitated just a fraction too long. "Houston. We were traveling. Long way from Houston to end up in Millbrook. We're not exactly on the way to anywhere." Before Grace could answer, the sound of sirens cut through the storm, growing louder as they approached. Jake felt a mix of relief and something else, disappointment, maybe. As if he wasn't quite ready for this strange interlude to end. The paramedics were efficient and professional, checking both Grace and Sam with thorough competence. The older of the two, a grizzled man named Pete, who Jake knew from high school, pulled him aside while his partner worked. "They're going to be okay," Pete said quietly. "The woman's got some bruised ribs and a possible concussion, but nothing life-threatening. The boy's fine, just a bump on the head and some bruising. But Jake," Pete's voice dropped lower, "those aren't accident injuries. Someone worked them over pretty good." Jake nodded grimly. "I figured as much. She said they were in a car accident, that someone stopped to help, but decided to help himself instead," Pete finished. "Happens more than you'd think. We'll have to report it, of course. Sheriff's probably going to want to talk to them." The thought of Sheriff Dawson's less than gentle interrogation style made Jake's stomach tighten. Dawson was old-school law enforcement: shoot first, ask questions later, and assume everyone was guilty of something. "They want to take us to the hospital," Grace said as the paramedics finished their examination. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the underlying tension. "That's probably a good idea," Jake said. "You should get checked out properly." "I don't have insurance," Grace said quickly. "And we can't afford—" The lie came so smoothly that Jake might have believed it if he hadn't already noticed the details that didn't fit. but something in her eyes, desperation maybe, or fear, made him hold his tongue. "County hospital has to treat you either way," he said instead. "Don't worry about the money." Grace bit her lip, looking from Sam to Jake and back again. "I don't suppose... would it be possible for us to just stay here tonight? Just until the storm passes? I promise we won't be any trouble." Pete looked at Jake with raised eyebrows. It was highly irregular, bordering on irresponsible. These were strangers, possibly victims of a violent crime, and the smart thing would be to let the professionals handle it. But Jake found himself looking at Emma, who was sitting on the edge of the couch next to Sam, showing him her stuffed rabbit, and explaining its intricate backstory in the serious way that only children could manage. He thought about the loneliness that had been eating at him for 18 months, the way the silence in their apartment above the garage sometimes felt like it might swallow him whole. "Yeah," he heard himself saying. "Yeah, you can stay." Pete shook his head but didn't argue. "Your funeral, Morrison. But if Sheriff Dawson asks, I never heard you say that." After the paramedics left, Jake found himself alone with 3 near strangers in his garage, while the storm continued to rage outside. Emma had convinced Sam to share her rabbit, and the 2 children were curled up together on the couch, talking in the whispered way kids did when they thought adults weren't listening. Grace stood at the window looking out at the rain-lashed street with an expression Jake couldn't read. In profile, with her dark hair still damp and curling around her shoulders, she looked like something out of a painting, beautiful and tragic and mysterious. "You didn't have to do this," she said without turning around. "Do what? Let us stay. Trust us. Most people wouldn't." Jake shrugged, though she couldn't see it. Most people aren't single fathers trying to raise a daughter who's too smart for her own good and too lonely for mine. That made her turn, and for a moment their eyes met across the garage. In the fluorescent light, her bruises looked stark and painful, but there was something else in her expression. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of recognition, as if she saw something in him that others missed. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long what?" "How long since you lost her?" "Your wife." Jake's first instinct was to shut down the conversation, to retreat behind the wall he'd built around his grief. But something about the way Grace asked, not prying, just understanding, made him answer honestly. 18 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. The precision of his answer surprised him. He hadn't realized he'd been counting. Grace nodded as if she understood exactly what those numbers meant. "And you've been doing this alone, raising Emma, running the garage?" "Sarah's parents live in Florida. My folks passed when I was in my 20s. Emma's all I've got left of..." He stopped, surprised by how much he'd revealed to this stranger. "That's a lot of weight for one person to carry." "Yeah, well, weight's something you get used to." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with something Jake couldn't name. Finally, Grace moved away from the window and sat down on the couch beside the children who had fallen asleep in a tangle of small limbs and strawberry blonde hair and dark curls. "They look peaceful," she observed. "Emma doesn't usually warm up to strangers that fast," Jake said. "She's been cautious since Sarah died. Doesn't like change, doesn't trust easily. Sam's the same way. It's been just the 2 of us for a while now." Jake wanted to ask where Sam's father was, what had happened to put them on the road in the middle of the night, why Grace's story didn't quite add up. But something in her posture, the protective way she held herself, the careful distance she maintained, even while sitting still, warned him off. Instead, he said, "You hungry? I could make some sandwiches or something." Grace's smile was small but genuine. That would be wonderful. Thank you. Jake's kitchen skills were limited but serviceable, a necessity when you were the only parent to a growing 7-year-old. He made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and found a bag of chips that wasn't too stale, arranging everything on paper plates, with the care Sarah had once used for formal dinner parties. They ate in companionable silence, the sound of the storm providing a steady backdrop. Grace ate carefully, favoring her injured ribs, but Jake noticed she finished every bite. When was the last time she'd eaten? When was the last time Sam had... "This is really good," Grace said, and Jake almost laughed. "It's peanut butter and jelly." "I know, but it's the first meal someone's made for me in a long time. It tastes like kindness." The simple honesty of the statement hit Jake harder than he'd expected. When was the last time someone had made him a meal? When was the last time anyone had shown him kindness without expecting something in return? "Where will you go?" he asked. "When the storm clears." Grace's face closed off again, that careful mask sliding back into place. "I'm not sure yet. We are traveling." "Running," Jake said quietly. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes sharp with something that might have been fear. "What? You're running from something, or someone?" Jake kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "It's okay. I'm not judging. Just, if you need help or if there's somewhere safe I can take you." For a moment, Grace looked like she might tell him the truth, whatever that was. Her mouth opened, and Jake saw something vulnerable flicker across her features. But then Sam stirred in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent, and the moment passed. "We'll figure something out," she said finally. "We always do." Jake wanted to press, but Emma chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepily and looking around in confusion before her gaze settled on the sleeping boy beside her. "Daddy, is Sam okay?" "He's fine, sweetheart. Just sleeping." Emma looked at Grace with the serious consideration that had become her default expression since Sarah's death. "Are you Sam's mama?" "I am." "My mama died," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Do you think she can see me from heaven?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Jake felt his chest tighten. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, the one he never felt equipped to have. But Grace leaned forward, her expression gentle and serious. "I think mothers never really leave their children even when they have to go to heaven. I think she watches over you and feels proud of what a brave, kind girl you are." Emma considered this solemnly. "Daddy says she would have liked our house. We moved here after she died because Daddy needed work, but he says she would have liked how I painted my room purple." "Purple is a very sophisticated color choice," Grace said with complete seriousness. "I bet she loves it." The easy way Grace talked to Emma, the respect she showed for a 7-year-old's questions and concerns, made something warm unfurl in Jake's chest. Sarah had been like that, able to talk to anyone to make them feel seen and heard and valued. "Can I show you my room?" Emma asked suddenly. "And maybe Sam could see it too when he wakes up." Jake started to object. It was late, Grace was injured. They were strangers, but Grace was already nodding. "I would love to see your room." They made an odd procession up the narrow stairs to the apartment above the garage, Jake carrying a still sleeping Emma, chattering quietly about her purple walls and her collection of books and her plans to be a veterinarian when she grew up, and Grace following behind, moving carefully but steadily. The apartment was small but clean, decorated with Sarah's touch and maintained with Jake's practical efficiency. Emma's room was indeed purple, a shade somewhere between lavender and grape that Sarah had called sophisticated plum and Jake had called expensive. "It's beautiful," Grace said, and Jake could tell she meant it. Very grown up. Emma beamed and launched into a detailed tour of her possessions while Jake settled Sam on the couch in the living room. The boy stirred as Jake covered him with one of Sarah's quilts, but didn't wake. "He looks so young," Grace said softly, appearing in the doorway. "Emma did too when Sarah died. It's funny how fast kids have to grow up when the world shifts under their feet." Grace's hand went instinctively to her bruised ribs, and Jake wondered what kind of world shifting she and Sam had experienced. "You can have my bed," he said. "I'll sleep out here with the kids." "I couldn't." "You could and you will. No arguments." Jake's tone brooked no disagreement. "Emma will want to sleep out here anyway with Sam. She gets lonely at night." Grace looked like she wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was clearly winning the battle. "Just for tonight," she said finally. "Just for tonight." Jake agreed, though something in the way she said it made him suspect she was trying to convince herself as much as him. After Grace disappeared into his bedroom, and Emma settled on the floor with her sleeping bag and stuffed animals, Jake found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since he'd heard that scream in the storm. He sat in his old recliner, Sarah's least favorite piece of furniture, which was probably why it had survived her death, and listened to the rain gradually diminish from a roar to a whisper. What was he doing? He'd taken in two strangers, possibly fugitives, without knowing anything about them beyond their names and the fact that someone had hurt them. It was reckless, impulsive, the kind of thing Sarah would have done without thinking twice and Jake would have spent hours talking her out of. But Sarah wasn't here to make impulsive decisions anymore, and Jake had spent 18 months being careful, being responsible, being the kind of father who planned ahead and thought things through and never ever took risks that might leave Emma orphaned. Maybe that was exactly why he was doing this. Maybe he was tired of being careful. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the way Grace had looked at Emma with genuine interest and respect rather than the condescending sweetness most adults used with children. Maybe it was the protective way she held herself around Sam, or the gratitude in her voice when she'd thanked him for a peanut butter sandwich. Or maybe it was just that for the first time in 18 months, the apartment didn't feel quite so empty. The storm was fading now, the thunder rolling away toward the east. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a clear Texas morning, and Grace and Sam would probably disappear as suddenly as they'd appeared. Jake would go back to his routine of work and worry and trying to be enough for Emma, and tonight would become just another story to tell himself when the loneliness got too heavy to bear. But right now, with the sound of Emma's steady breathing and Sam's occasional sleepy murmur and the almost silent presence of Grace in his bedroom, Jake felt something he'd forgotten existed, the possibility that his life might be more than just surviving until Emma was old enough to leave him too. It was a dangerous feeling, hope. But as Jake finally drifted off to sleep, in his recliner, he found he didn't care about the danger anymore. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, and the first tentative stars appeared in the clearing sky, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what the morning would bring. Dawn broke over Millbrook like a whispered promise, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossible after the violence of the storm. Jake woke with a crick in his neck and the unfamiliar sound of children's laughter drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, caught between sleep and consciousness, he thought he heard Sarah humming while she made breakfast, and his heart performed that familiar dance of hope and crushing disappointment that had become his morning ritual. But the voice wasn't Sarah's. It was lighter, more musical, with an accent that spoke of private schools and debutante balls rather than small-town Texas. Grace. Jake stretched, wincing at the protest from muscles that had spent the night conforming to the shape of his recliner, and followed the sound of voices toward his kitchen. What he found there stopped him cold in the doorway. Grace stood at his stove, her dark hair pulled back in a makeshift ponytail, wearing one of Sarah's old aprons over her torn clothes. Despite the bruises that painted half her face in shades of purple and yellow, she moved with an easy grace as she flipped pancakes with the skill of someone accustomed to feeding others. Emma sat at the small kitchen table chattering away, while Sam, looking remarkably better in the morning light, helped her sort through a box of crayons. "The blue ones are my favorite," Emma was saying seriously. "But purple is good too. Do you like purple, Sam?" "Purple's okay," Sam replied, his voice still carrying the careful politeness that made Jake's chest ache. "But I like green better. Green like trees." "We don't have many trees here," Emma said apologetically. "Just the old oak out back. But Mama planted roses before she went to heaven, and they're really pretty in the summer." Jake cleared his throat, and three faces turned toward him, with varying expressions of surprise and something that might have been guilt. "Morning," he said, his voice rougher than usual from sleep and emotion. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Grace interrupted, gesturing toward the stack of golden pancakes with the spatula. "It's the least I could do after everything you've done for us." There was something in her tone, a formality, that hadn't been there the night before, and Jake realized she was preparing to leave. The thought hit him with unexpected force. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a mug. "Please." Jake accepted the cup gratefully, noting that she'd somehow managed to make it exactly the way he liked it, strong enough to strip paint with just a splash of milk. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Grace said quickly, but Jake caught the slight flush that crept up her neck. She'd been watching him, learning his habits, and the realization sent an uncomfortable warmth through his chest. Breakfast was a surprisingly comfortable affair, despite the undercurrent of things unsaid. Sam ate with the mechanical precision of a child who'd learned not to waste food, while Emma kept up a steady stream of conversation that filled the silence with questions about Sam's favorite animals, his favorite colors, whether he'd ever seen a real cowboy. "Are you a real cowboy, Mr. Jake?" Sam asked suddenly, his brown eyes wide with curiosity. Jake almost choked on his coffee. "Not exactly sport. I fix cars, not wrangle cattle." "But you have boots," Sam pointed out, gesturing toward Jake's worn work boots. "And a hat." He nodded toward the baseball cap hanging on a hook by the door. "That's a baseball cap, not a cowboy hat," Emma corrected with the authority of someone who took accuracy very seriously. "Real cowboy hats are bigger, and they're made of felt or straw, not cotton." "How do you know all that?" Grace asked, smiling at Emma's earnest explanation. "Daddy got me books about cowboys for my birthday. Did you know that most cowboys were actually quite young? Some were only teenagers when they drove cattle across the country." Jake watched Grace's face as Emma spoke, noting the way her expression softened the genuine interest in her eyes. Sarah had been like that too, able to connect with children on their level without talking down to them. "That must have been very brave," Grace said. "Being so young and responsible for so much." "Emma's the same way," Jake found himself saying. "Braver than she should have to be." Grace's eyes met his across the table, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with understanding. She knew what it was like to carry weight that belonged to adults, to be responsible for someone smaller and more vulnerable than yourself. The moment was broken by the sound of a car door slamming outside, followed by heavy footsteps on the gravel. Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized the particular cadence of those steps. "Shit," he muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry." Language. But Grace was already tense, her entire body going rigid with the kind of alertness that spoke of practiced fear. "Who is it?" "Sheriff Dawson," Jake said grimly. He probably wants to ask you about last night." The color drained from Grace's face so quickly that Jake thought she might faint. Her hand went instinctively to Sam's shoulder, pulling him closer with a protectiveness that was almost fierce. "We should go," she said, already standing. "We should—" "Stay right where you are," Jake said firmly. "You haven't done anything wrong." But even as he said it, Jake could see the panic building in Grace's eyes, the way her breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. Whatever she was running from, whoever had hurt her and Sam, the arrival of law enforcement, was clearly her worst nightmare. The knock on the door was sharp and authoritative, the kind of sound that brooked no delay. Jake squeezed Grace's shoulder gently. "It'll be okay," he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. "Let me handle this." Sheriff Buck Dawson was exactly what central casting would order for a small-town Texas lawman, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been sheriff for as long as Jake could remember, elected and re-elected on a platform of law and order that sometimes interpreted both concepts rather loosely. "Morning, Jake," Dawson said, touching the brim of his hat. "Heard you had some excitement last night." "Nothing that couldn't be handled," Jake replied carefully. "Coffee? Don't mind if I do." Dawson stepped into the kitchen, his presence immediately making the small space feel crowded. His gaze swept over the scene, the breakfast dishes, the children sitting close together, Grace standing protectively behind Sam's chair. "You must be Grace Miller," Dawson said, his tone deceptively casual. "I'm Sheriff Dawson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about last night, if you don't mind." "Of course," Grace said, but Jake could hear the tremor beneath her composed exterior. Dawson pulled out a small notebook, the kind that had gone out of style with most law enforcement agencies years ago. "Pete Mullins said you and your boy here were the victims of an assault. Said someone attacked you after your car broke down." "That's right," Grace said carefully. "We were traveling and our car had engine trouble. A man stopped to help, but then he tried to rob us." Jake watched Dawson's face as Grace told her story. The sheriff's expression remained neutral, but Jake had known him long enough to recognize the skeptical glint in his eyes. "This man," Dawson said, making notes. "Can you describe him?" Grace hesitated for just a moment too long. It was dark and raining. He was average height, maybe. Dark hair. I didn't get a good look at his face. Dawson's pen scratched across the paper. "And your car, where'd you say it broke down?" "About 10 miles out of town. On Highway 67. Jake knew Highway 67 like he knew his own driveway. It was the main route through Millbrook, and Jake had driven it hundreds of times. There was no way Grace could have walked 10 miles in the storm last night, not in her condition, not carrying Sam. "That's a long walk in the rain," Dawson observed mildly, "especially with a hurt child." "The man who attacked us. He drove us partway into town before we got away," Grace said, but Jake could see the sweat beading on her forehead despite the morning cool. Emma, who had been unusually quiet during the questioning, suddenly piped up. "Sheriff Dawson, did you know that some cowboys were as young as 14? Daddy got me a book about it." Dawson's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at Emma. "Is that so? Well, those were different times, little lady. Takes a special kind of courage to do a man's job when you're still a child." "That's what I told Sam," Emma said proudly, "about being brave." The sheriff's attention shifted to Sam, who had been sitting silently throughout the questioning. "And what about you, son? You remember anything about this man who hurt you and your mama?" Sam's eyes darted to Grace, then to Jake, then back to the sheriff. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He was big, and he smelled like cigarettes. and he had a ring on his finger that hurt when he hit Mama. The simple, matter-of-fact way Sam delivered this information hit Jake like a physical blow. The child spoke with the kind of resigned acceptance that came from experience, as if violence was just another weather pattern to be endured. Dawson's expression darkened. "A ring, you say? What kind of ring?" "Shiny," Sam said. "With a red stone." Grace's hand tightened on Sam's shoulder, and Jake saw her exchange a look with her son that seemed to carry an entire conversation. There was more to this story, layers of truth that weren't being shared, and Jake was beginning to suspect that the man with the ring wasn't some random highway predator. "Well," Dawson said, finally closing his notebook, "I'll put the word out, see if anyone else saw anything unusual last night. You planning on sticking around town for a while, Mrs. Miller?" The question was casual, but Jake heard the steel beneath it. Dawson wasn't asking. He was telling. "We were hoping to move on today," Grace said carefully. "Continue our trip." "I'm afraid that's not going to be possible," Dawson replied. "This is an ongoing investigation, and I'll need you available for follow-up questions. Plus, your boy here needs medical attention. Can't have you dragging him around the countryside with a head injury." And Grace's face went pale again, but before she could respond, Jake heard himself saying, "They can stay here until Sam's feeling better and you've wrapped up your investigation." Dawson raised an eyebrow. "That's mighty generous of you, Jake. You sure about that?" Jake wasn't sure about anything, but the look of desperate gratitude in Grace's eyes made the decision for him. "They're not going anywhere in that beat-up old Honda anyway. I saw it this morning when I went to get the newspaper. Thing looks like it's held together with prayer and duct tape." It was a lie. Jake hadn't seen any car, but something in Grace's expression told him he'd guessed correctly about her mode of transportation. "Well then," Dawson said, standing and adjusting his hat, "I guess that settles it. Mrs. Miller, I'll be in touch if I have any more questions. Jake, appreciate you being a good neighbor." After the sheriff left, the kitchen fell into a silence so complete that Jake could hear the old clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. Grace stood frozen behind Sam's chair, her face a mask of carefully controlled panic. "Grace," Jake said gently, "you want to tell me what's really going on here?" For a moment he thought she might actually do it. Her mouth opened, and he saw the desperate need to trust someone to share the burden she'd been carrying alone. But then Sam looked up at her with those two serious brown eyes, and she closed herself off again. "I told you. We were attacked." "No," Jake interrupted, but his voice remained gentle. "You were attacked, that much is true. But not by some random highway robber. Someone you know hurt you. Someone with a ring that left marks. Sam will probably remember for the rest of his life." Grace's composure finally cracked, and Jake saw tears spill down her cheeks. "You don't understand. You don't know what you're getting involved in." "Then tell me," Jake said simply. "Help me understand." "Daddy," Emma said suddenly, her voice unusually small. "Sam's crying." Jake looked down and saw that she was right. Silent tears were streaming down the little boy's face as he watched his mother's breakdown with the resigned expression of someone who'd seen it too many times before. "Hey, sport," Jake said, kneeling beside Sam's chair. "You know what Emma's been wanting to show someone her secret fort out back? You want to go exploring while the grown-ups talk?" Sam looked to Grace for permission, and she nodded through her tears. "Go ahead, baby. Have fun." After the children disappeared into the backyard, their voices fading into the distance, Grace sank into her chair as if her strings had been cut. "His name is Montgomery Hamilton," she said finally, her voice so quiet Jake had to strain to hear it. "Sam's grandfather. and he's going to kill me if he finds us." The name hit Jake like a slap. Montgomery Hamilton, oil baron, political kingmaker, the kind of man whose face graced the covers of business magazines and whose donations bought and sold politicians like livestock. Jake had seen him on the news countless times, usually announcing some new acquisition or charitable donation that would enhance his already legendary reputation. "Jesus," Jake breathed. "You're talking about that Montgomery Hamilton, the oil guy." Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. The oil guy, the philanthropist, the pillar of the community, the man who tried to buy my son from me, and when that didn't work, decided to take him by force. Jake felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "You're not Grace Miller." "No." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of mascara across her cheek. "I'm Evelyn Grace Hamilton, and Sam is worth about $3 billion. The number hung in the air between them like smoke. $3 billion. Jake tried to wrap his mind around it and failed completely. The most money he'd ever seen at one time was the $5,000 he'd gotten for Sarah's engagement ring after she died, and he'd spent that on Emma's medical bills from when she'd broken her arm 6 months later. "Your maiden name," Jake said slowly. "It's really Grace. Evelyn Grace, but I've always gone by Grace. My friends in college called me Gracie." She smiled sadly. "I haven't been Gracie in a long time." "And Sam's father?" Grace's expression hardened. Sam's father was Montgomery's son, was being the operative term. Richard died in a car accident when Sam was 2. "I'm sorry," Jake said, and meant it. "That must have been—" "The accident wasn't an accident," Grace interrupted, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Richard was going to divorce me and take Sam away from Montgomery's influence. He'd found out about some of his father's business practices, and he was planning to go to the authorities. 3 days before he was supposed to meet with the FBI, his brakes failed on a mountain road in Colorado." Jake stared at her, trying to process what she was telling him. "You think Montgomery killed his own son? I know he did. Just like I know he'll kill me if it means getting control of Sam's inheritance." Grace's hands were shaking now, and Jake had to resist the urge to cover them with his own. Sam inherited everything when Richard died. The oil company, the real estate holdings, the investments. But it's all held in trust until he turns 21, with Montgomery as the trustee. "That's a lot of power," Jake said quietly. "It's everything. Montgomery Hamilton doesn't just own oil wells and office buildings. He owns politicians, judges, police chiefs. He's been building his empire for 40 years, and Sam represents the next 40. Jake thought about Sheriff Dawson's questions, his insistence that Grace stick around town. How long before word got back to the wrong people that Evelyn Hamilton and her son had been found in a small Texas town? "How long have you been running?" he asked. 6 months. Ever since Montgomery tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could gain full custody of Sam." Grace's laugh was bitter. "Apparently grief makes women irrational and unfit to raise children, at least according to the psychiatrist Montgomery paid to evaluate me. But you got away. Richard left me some money that Montgomery didn't know about. Cash hidden in accounts under different names. Enough to disappear for a while, but not enough to disappear forever." Grace looked toward the window where they could see Emma and Sam examining something in the dirt near the old oak tree. "I thought if I could just keep moving, keep Sam safe until he was older, until he could understand what was at stake. But Montgomery found you." Grace nodded. 3 days ago in Austin. I don't know how. We were so careful, but somehow he tracked us to the motel where we were staying. His men came in the middle of the night." Jake felt cold anger building in his chest. Those bruises that cut on Sam's head, That was Montgomery's doing, his security team. They were supposed to bring us back alive, but they weren't particularly concerned about what condition we'd be in when we arrived. Grace touched her swollen eye gingerly. We managed to get away, but just barely. I stole a car from the motel parking lot. I know that was wrong, but I was desperate and drove until it ran out of gas about 5 miles from here. So you walked the rest of the way in the storm. Carried Sam most of the way, actually. He was barely conscious after they hit him. Grace's voice broke slightly. He's 5 years old, Jake. 5 years old, and he's been through more violence than most adults see in a lifetime. Jake thought about the way Sam had asked if Jake was going to hurt them, the casual way he'd described the man with the ring. No child should have to develop that kind of survival instinct. What about the police, the FBI? Surely someone... Montgomery owns them. Maybe not directly, but he's got enough influence to make any investigation disappear. The local police in Austin didn't even file a report about the domestic dispute at the motel. Said it was a family matter best handled privately. Jake rubbed his face trying to think. This was so far beyond his experience that he felt like he was drowning. What did a small-town mechanic know about oil empires and family dynasties, and the kind of wealth that could make people disappear? But then he looked at Grace, really looked at her. Beneath the fear and exhaustion, beneath the bruises and the careful composure, he saw something that reminded him of Sarah. Not physically, they couldn't have been more different in that regard. But there was something in the way Grace held herself, in the fierce protectiveness she showed toward Sam, that spoke to a core of strength that even Montgomery Hamilton's money couldn't break. "What do you need?" he asked simply. Grace stared at him. What do you need to keep Sam safe, to get away from Montgomery, to build some kind of life for yourself? What do you need? Jake, you don't understand. This man has unlimited resources. He can... I understand plenty, Jake interrupted gently. I understand that you're a mother trying to protect her son. I understand that sometimes the people who are supposed to help you are the ones you can't trust. And I understand that everybody needs someone in their corner, even if that someone is just a broke mechanic from a nowhere town in Texas. Grace was crying again, but these tears looked different, not desperate or panicked, but something closer to relief. You could get hurt. Emma could get hurt. If Montgomery finds out you helped us. Let me worry about Montgomery Hamilton, Jake said with more confidence than he felt. Right now, the question is, what happens next? Before Grace could answer, the screen door slammed open, and Emma burst into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement and dirt streaking her clothes. Daddy, you have to come see what Sam found. There's a whole family of baby rabbits living under the old oak tree, and they're the cutest things ever. And Sam thinks we should build them a little house so they'll be safe from the fox that lives in the woods. Behind Emma, Sam appeared in the doorway, looking more animated than Jake had seen him since they'd arrived. His face was streaked with dirt, and his clothes were grass-stained, but for the first time he looked like a normal 5-year-old who'd been playing outside on a beautiful morning. Can we, Mama? Sam asked Grace eagerly. Can we build them a house? Emma says her daddy has lots of wood and tools and stuff. Grace looked at her son, really looked at him, and Jake saw something shift in her expression. For 6 months, she'd been focused on keeping Sam alive, on staying one step ahead of Montgomery's reach. But somewhere in that desperate flight, she'd forgotten that Sam was still a little boy who needed to play and explore and get dirty and excited about baby rabbits. I think that sounds like a wonderful idea, Grace said softly. If Mr. Jake doesn't mind sharing his tools. Are you kidding? Jake said, standing up. I've got a whole workshop full of tools that never get used for anything fun. This sounds like the best project I've heard of in years. As they headed outside to examine the rabbit burrow, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The sense that his life was expanding rather than contracting that possibility was creeping back into the spaces that grief had hollowed out. He had no idea what he was going to do about Montgomery Hamilton, or how he was going to keep Grace and Sam safe. He didn't know if Sheriff Dawson could be trusted, or how long it would take for word to reach the wrong ears. He couldn't even be certain that he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his life by getting involved in something so far beyond his understanding. But as he watched Emma and Sam planning their rabbit rescue mission with the serious intensity that only children could bring to such endeavors, and as he felt Grace's grateful presence beside him, Jake realized that for the first time in 18 months, he was more interested in tomorrow than he was afraid of it. That had to count for something. The next 3 weeks passed like a dream Jake was afraid to wake up from. The Rabbit House project had evolved into something far more elaborate than anyone had anticipated, a miniature architectural marvel complete with multiple chambers, escape routes, and what Emma insisted on calling a bunny penthouse. Every morning, Sam would rush outside to check on their furry tenants, his face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made Grace's eyes fill with tears she tried to hide. Jake found himself looking forward to these moments with an intensity that surprised him. The sound of children's laughter echoing through his garage, the sight of Grace humming while she reorganized his chaotic filing system with the efficiency of someone accustomed to running complex operations. The unexpected warmth of shared meals around his small kitchen table. It all felt like a life he'd glimpsed once in dreams, but never imagined he could actually live. Grace had slipped into their routine with the seamless grace of someone who understood the delicate machinery of family life. She never overstepped, never tried to replace Sarah's memory, but somehow she filled spaces Jake hadn't even realized were empty. She helped Emma with her homework in the evenings, her patient explanations of long division, revealing a sharp mind that had clearly received the finest education money could buy. She organized Jake's business receipts with the kind of systematic efficiency that turned his seasonal tax preparation from a nightmare into a manageable afternoon. And she cooked not just competently, but with the kind of creativity that transformed his bare-bones grocery budget into meals that made the apartment feel like a home again. But underneath the domestic tranquility, tension simmered like water about to boil. Every car that slowed past the garage made Grace freeze mid-conversation. Every knock at the door, whether it was Mrs. Henderson from next door borrowing sugar, or the UPS driver delivering parts, sent her into a panic that took longer each time to subside. Jake watched her carefully rationing the cash from her dwindling emergency fund, saw the way she studied the classified ads with the desperate focus of someone running out of options. Sheriff Dawson had stopped by twice more, his questions becoming more pointed each time. He'd run the plates on the Honda Grace claimed to have been driving the one that Jake had told him was broken down outside town, and discovered it had been reported stolen from an Austin motel 3 weeks ago. Grace had maintained her story about the mysterious attacker, but Jake could see that Dawson's skepticism was hardening into suspicion. "There's something about her that doesn't add up," Dawson had told Jake during his most recent visit, accepting a cup of coffee while Grace was at the grocery store with the children. "Woman like that doesn't end up in a place like this by accident." "What's that supposed to mean, a woman like that?" Jake had asked, though he knew exactly what Dawson meant. Even wearing his old clothes and trying to blend in, Grace couldn't hide the markers of wealth and privilege, the way she carried herself, the unconscious authority in her voice when she spoke to service people, the expensive dental work that showed when she smiled. "Come on, Jake. Look at her hands. You ever see calluses like that from washing dishes? And the way she talks, that's not small-town Texas. That's finishing school and country clubs." Dawson had leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with those sharp gray eyes. Question is, what's a woman like that running from that's bad enough to make her steal a car and flee across state lines? Jake had deflected as best he could, but he knew Dawson wasn't going to let it go. Small-town sheriffs didn't stay in office for 20 years by ignoring their instincts, and every one of Dawson's instincts was telling him that Grace Miller was not who she claimed to be. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening that had started like any other. Jake was teaching Sam how to use a socket wrench, while Grace helped Emma with a science project about plant growth. The domestic scene was so normal, so perfect, that Jake had almost forgotten about the shadow hanging over them. Almost. The black SUVs appeared without warning, sliding into the gravel lot outside Morrison's garage, like sharks cutting through water. Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized the configuration: 3 vehicles positioned to block all exits, their tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupants inside. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice cutting through Emma's explanation of photosynthesis like a blade. "Take the kids. Back room. Now." But it was already too late. The SUV doors opened in synchronized precision, disgorging 6 men in expensive suits, who moved with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit. And behind them, stepping from the middle vehicle, with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to owning everything he surveyed, came Montgomery Hamilton himself. Jake had seen the man on television countless times, but his physical presence was something altogether different. Montgomery Hamilton was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of patrician features that graced old money and older power. His suit probably cost more than Jake made in 6 months, and he wore it with the unconscious ease of someone who had never questioned his right to the finest things in life. But it was his eyes that made Jake's skin crawl pale blue and utterly cold like winter sky over a frozen lake. "Mr. Morrison, I presume?" Montgomery said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of East Coast boarding schools and Ivy League universities. "I'm Montgomery Hamilton. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jake positioned himself between Montgomery and the doorway to the apartment, his hand moving instinctively to the heavy wrench on his workbench. "I don't know what you're talking about." Montgomery's smile was the kind predators wore just before they struck. "Of course you don't. You're just a simple mechanic who happened to find 2 injured strangers in a storm. A good Samaritan with no idea that he's been harboring fugitives." "They're not fugitives," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "They're victims. Victims." Montgomery laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "My dear Mr. Morrison, I'm afraid you've been terribly misled. The woman calling herself Grace Miller is actually my daughter-in-law, Evelyn Hamilton. She's suffering from severe mental illness brought on by grief, and she's kidnapped my grandson. I've been searching for them for months, desperately worried about their safety." The story was delivered with such conviction, such apparent sincerity, that Jake might have believed it if he hadn't seen the fear in Grace's eyes, hadn't heard Sam describe the ring that left marks when it struck. "If that's true," Jake said carefully, "then why not call the police? Why the private army?" "The police?" Montgomery's expression suggested the very idea was distasteful. "Mr. Morrison, when you're dealing with family matters of this sensitivity, discretion is paramount. The last thing a traumatized child needs is to be caught in the middle of a media circus." "Grandpa," the small voice cut through the tension like a lightning bolt. Sam had appeared in the doorway despite Jake's instructions, his brown eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Behind him, Jake could see Grace and Emma huddled together, Grace's face pale with terror. Montgomery's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The cold calculation vanished, replaced by what looked like genuine warmth and concern. "Hello, Samuel. Grandpa's been so worried about you." Sam stepped forward hesitantly, and Jake felt his heart break at the conflicted expression on the boy's face. This was still his grandfather, still the man who had presumably spoiled him with expensive toys and elaborate birthday parties before everything went wrong. "We built a house for rabbits," Sam said quietly. "Emma and Mr. Jake helped me. There are 7 babies." "How wonderful," Montgomery said, crouching to Sam's eye level with movements that spoke of practiced charm. "You always were such a clever boy, just like your father when he was your age." Jake saw the way Sam's face crumpled at the mention of his father, saw the tears that sprang to his eyes. In that moment, Montgomery's mask slipped just enough for Jake to see the cold satisfaction beneath the grandfatherly facade. He was using the boy's grief as a weapon, and he knew it. "Sam, sweetie, come back here," Grace called from the doorway, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Montgomery's head turned toward her voice, and his expression hardened again. "Evelyn, you look unwell." Grace stepped into view, and Jake was struck by the transformation that came over her. Gone was the warm, slightly uncertain woman who had been sharing his life for 3 weeks. In her place stood someone Jake barely recognized, shoulders back, chin raised every inch, the oil heiress despite wearing his old clothes. "Hello, Montgomery," she said, her voice carrying the kind of ice that could freeze fire. "Still traveling with an entourage, I see. Some things never change." "Some things do," Montgomery replied, his tone deceptively mild. "Your appearance, for instance. Rural living clearly doesn't agree with you." Jake felt rather than saw Grace flinch at the calculated cruelty of the comment, but when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "What do you want?" "I want my grandson home where he belongs. I want him receiving the medical care and psychological support he clearly needs after this adventure. And I want you to get the help you so desperately require." "The only help I need is a restraining order," Grace shot back, but Jake could hear the tremor beneath her bravado. Montgomery sighed with what seemed like genuine sadness. "Evelyn, please. Look at yourself. Look at what you've done to that poor child. Living on the run, sleeping in motels, associating with—" His gaze swept dismissively over Jake. "Strangers who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of your situation." "Mr. Jake is nice," Sam said suddenly, his small voice carrying clearly in the charged silence. "He taught me how to use tools, and Emma is my friend." Montgomery's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure Mr. Jake is very nice, but Sam, you belong at home with people who can take proper care of you. People who can give you the education and opportunities your father would have wanted." "My father would have wanted me to be safe," Sam said, with a clarity that surprised everyone. "My father would have wanted Mama to be safe too." For just a moment, Montgomery's composure cracked completely. Jake saw rage flash across the older man's features, not the hot anger of someone caught off guard, but the cold fury of someone accustomed to absolute control, finding that control challenged by a 5-year-old child. "Your father," Montgomery said carefully, "is no longer here to make those decisions. That responsibility falls to me as your legal guardian." "You're not his legal guardian," Grace said sharply. "I'm his mother. I have sole custody." "Had," Montgomery corrected with satisfaction. "Past tense, my dear. You see, when a mother kidnaps her child and flees across state lines, when she steals cars and consorts with convicted felons." "I'm not a convicted felon," Jake interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. Montgomery barely glanced at him. 3 arrests for disorderly conduct, 2 for public intoxication, 1 for assault that was mysteriously dropped when the complainant refused to testify. "Shall I continue?" Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Those arrests were from the dark months after Sarah's death, when grief and alcohol had nearly destroyed what was left of his life. The assault charge had been dropped because the complainant, a drunk, who'd been harassing a waitress at Murphy's bar, had decided he didn't want to explain to a judge why he'd needed 6 stitches after calling a grieving widower's dead wife a whore. "That's not—" Jake started, but Montgomery cut him off. "The point is, Mr. Morrison, that a family court judge might find it concerning that my traumatized grandson has been living with a man with such a colorful past. Add that to his mother's obvious mental instability, and I think you'll find that custody arrangements can change quite rapidly." Grace's face had gone ashen. "You can't. I won't let you." "You won't let me." Montgomery's laugh was genuinely amused. "My dear Evelyn, what exactly do you think you can do to stop me? You have no money, I've frozen all your accounts. You have no legal representation. What lawyer would take a case against Hamilton Oil without a substantial retainer? You have no friends, no family, no resources beyond the charity of a small-town mechanic who's already in over his head." Jake watched Grace's composure finally beginning to crumble, saw the terrible knowledge in her eyes that Montgomery was right. What could she do against unlimited wealth and political connections? How could someone with nothing fight someone who owned everything? However, Montgomery continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. "I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand that grief makes people do irrational things, so I'm prepared to offer you a choice." Grace said nothing, but Jake could see her entire body tensing for whatever blow was coming. Option 1, you come home voluntarily. You submit to psychiatric evaluation and treatment. You acknowledge that your recent behavior was the result of mental illness brought on by grief, and you work with me to ensure Samuel receives the stability and care he needs. In return, I'll ensure you have supervised visitation rights and access to the finest medical care money can buy. "And option 2, Grace asked, though Jake could tell she already knew. "Option 2 is that I have you arrested for kidnapping, car theft, and child endangerment. You spend the next several years in prison, while Samuel lives with me, gradually forgetting that he ever had a mother who loved him more than her own sanity." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the wind rustling through the oak tree outside, could hear one of the baby rabbits making soft, chittering sounds in their carefully constructed house. "You have 5 minutes to decide," Montgomery said, checking an expensive watch. "I have a helicopter waiting to take Samuel home, and frankly, I'd prefer not to traumatize the boy any more than necessary." Jake felt something snap inside his chest, not breaking, but clicking into place like a gear finally finding its proper position. For 18 months, he'd been drifting, surviving, letting life happen to him, rather than making choices that mattered. But standing here, watching a powerful man casually destroy a mother's love for her child, Jake remembered what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. "There's a third option," he said quietly. Montgomery turned to him with the kind of dismissive attention one might give to a particularly persistent insect. "Mr. Morrison, I believe I've been quite clear about your position in this matter. You would be wise to—" "The third option," Jake continued, his voice growing stronger, "is that you get in your fancy cars and drive away, and we pretend this conversation never happened." Montgomery's expression shifted to something like genuine amusement. "And why exactly would I do that?" Jake smiled, and for the first time since the SUVs had arrived, he felt like he was on solid ground. "Because Sheriff Dawson is probably going to be very interested in hearing about how Montgomery Hamilton showed up at a local garage with 6 armed men to terrorize a woman and child." "Sheriff Dawson," Montgomery said with evident satisfaction, "is already well aware of the situation. In fact, he's the one who confirmed your location for me." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Dawson had sold them out, probably for a sum that dwarfed the sheriff's annual salary. Grace made a small broken sound, and Jake realized that this had been her deepest fear all along, that even here in this small corner of nowhere, Montgomery's reach would find them. However, Montgomery continued, clearly enjoying Jake's shock. Sheriff Dawson is also a practical man who understands the value of discretion. He has no desire to see his community embroiled in a messy custody dispute that would inevitably attract unwanted media attention. Jake felt the last of his options slipping away like sand through his fingers. What could a small-town mechanic do against someone who owned sheriffs and judges and probably half the politicians in the state? But then he looked at Emma, who was standing in the doorway, with her arms wrapped around Sam's shoulders, her blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, blazing with the kind of righteous fury that only children could muster in the face of injustice. And he remembered something Sarah had told him once during one of their late-night conversations about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of father he hoped to become. Sometimes, she'd said, her hand warm in his, the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing. And when that happens, you have to decide who you want to be when you look in the mirror. Jake had been making smart choices for 18 months, safe choices, careful choices, choices that protected what little he had left. But standing here watching Montgomery Hamilton casually tear apart a family because he had the power to do it, Jake realized he was tired of being smart. "Grace," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Montgomery, "take the kids upstairs." "Jake, don't," Grace whispered. "He'll destroy you. He'll destroy everything." "Some things are worth being destroyed for," Jake replied, and meant it. Montgomery was watching this exchange with the detached interest of someone observing an anthill. "Mr. Morrison, I admire your chivalrous instincts, but surely you can see that this situation is beyond your ability to influence. You're a mechanic in a small Texas town. I control resources that you can't even imagine." "Maybe," Jake said, moving to position himself between Montgomery and the children. "But you know what I've got that you don't." "I can't imagine." Nothing left to lose. For the first time since he'd arrived, Montgomery looked genuinely uncertain. Men like him understood greed, fear, ambition, emotions that could be manipulated and leveraged. But someone who had already lost everything that mattered, someone who had reached the point where principle outweighed survival, that was a variable that didn't fit into any of his carefully constructed equations. "You're making a mistake," Montgomery said, his voice losing some of its smooth confidence. "Probably," Jake agreed. "But it's my mistake to make." The standoff stretched on tension, crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Jake could feel Grace's presence behind him, could sense her fear and desperate hope warring in the silence. He could hear Emma whispering something to Sam, probably trying to explain why the adults were all acting so strange and scary. Finally, Montgomery stepped back, straightening his expensive tie, with movements that suggested he was reasserting control over the situation. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. You want to play protector? Let's see how long your noble intentions last, when the reality of your situation becomes clear." He turned to his men, speaking in a tone that was businesslike and terrifyingly casual. "Gentlemen, it seems Mr. Morrison needs some time to reconsider his position. Perhaps a few days without electricity or phone service will help clarify his thinking. And I believe his garage is due for an inspection by the county safety violations, environmental concerns, that sort of thing." Amazing how quickly bureaucratic problems can multiply when one attracts the wrong kind of attention. Jake felt his stomach drop as the implications hit him. Without power, he couldn't run the garage. Without the garage, he had no income. And if Montgomery could manufacture safety violations serious enough to shut him down permanently, of course, Montgomery continued, his voice growing warmer as he sensed Jake's dawning realization. All of these unfortunate circumstances could be avoided if we could reach a reasonable accommodation. I'm not an unreasonable man, Mr. Morrison. I simply want what's best for my grandson. Jake thought about Emma's school clothes, about the medical bills that were still trickling in from Sarah's final hospital stay, about the mortgage payment that was already 2 weeks late. He thought about the life he'd built here, modest as it was, and how quickly it could all disappear if someone with enough money and influence decided to make it happen. But then he thought about Sam's matter-of-fact description of the ring that hurt when it hit his mother. He thought about Grace's desperate flight across half the country, carrying her unconscious child through a thunderstorm, because even that was safer than staying where Montgomery could find them. "Evelyn," Montgomery said, apparently interpreting Jake's silence as capitulation. "You've had your adventure. You've proven whatever point you felt needed proving. But surely you can see that this has gone far enough. Come home. Let me help you get well. Let Samuel have the life his father would have wanted for him." Grace stepped forward, and Jake was struck again by the transformation that came over her in Montgomery's presence. Every trace of the warm, uncertain woman who had been sharing his life vanished, replaced by someone who carried herself like royalty, which Jake supposed she was in her way. "Richard would have wanted his son to be safe," she said, her voice carrying across the garage like a bell. "He would have wanted him to grow up knowing the difference between right and wrong. He would have wanted him to understand that money and power don't give you the right to hurt people who can't fight back." Richard, Montgomery said, with a slight emphasis on his son's name, had idealistic notions that would have destroyed everything our family built. Thankfully, that's no longer a concern. The casual way he dismissed his dead son's moral objections sent a chill down Jake's spine. This wasn't grief-talking, or even disappointment. This was a man who saw his own son's death as a minor inconvenience in his larger plans. Samuel saw Montgomery called, crouching down again to the boy's eye level. "Come say hello to Grandpa properly. I've missed you so much." Sam looked uncertainly between his mother and his grandfather, clearly torn between affection and fear. In the end, he took a few hesitant steps forward, stopping just out of Montgomery's reach. "I missed you too, Grandpa," Sam said quietly. "But I like it here. Mr. Jake is teaching me about engines, and Emma showed me how to read chapter books." "That's wonderful, Samuel. But you know, at home you could have the finest tutors, the best schools. You could learn about much more than engines and chapter books." "I like engines," Sam said with a 5-year-old's stubborn loyalty. "And I like chapter books. And I like the baby rabbits." Montgomery's smile tightened. "Of course you do. But Samuel, sometimes we have to leave behind childish things and focus on what's really important. You're going to inherit a great responsibility someday, and you need to be prepared for it." "I don't want to inherit anything," Sam said with startling clarity. "I just want to stay with Mama and Mr. Jake and Emma." The simple honesty of the statement hit everyone like a physical blow. Montgomery's mask slipped completely for a moment, revealing something ugly and predatory beneath the grandfatherly facade. Grace made a small, choked sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, and Jake felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest, something that had nothing to do with smart choices or careful calculations. "Well," Montgomery said, standing and brushing imaginary dust from his suit, "it seems we have some work to do on Samuel's perspective. Children often don't understand what's best for them." He gestured to his men, and they began moving with the same coordinated precision they'd shown when they arrived. But instead of returning to their vehicles, they spread out around the garage, their intentions unmistakably clear. "What are you doing?" Grace demanded, stepping protectively in front of Sam. Ensuring that my grandson comes home where he belongs, Montgomery replied. With or without your cooperation. Jake grabbed the wrench from his workbench, knowing it was useless against 6 trained men, but needing to hold something solid in his hands. You're not taking him. Montgomery sighed as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. Mr. Morrison, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and completely out of your league. Stand aside, and this can all be over quickly and quietly. No. The word came out flat and final, carrying the weight of every choice Jake had made and every choice he was willing to make. He thought about Sarah, about the way she'd faced her cancer diagnosis, with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else. She'd never backed down from a fight that mattered even when the odds were impossible. Montgomery's expression hardened into something that belonged on a different face entirely. Very well. Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Morrison and his daughter to a safe distance while we collect Samuel. The men began moving forward, and Jake raised the wrench, knowing it was hopeless, but unable to do anything else. This was it, the moment when his new life, fragile as it was, would be torn apart by forces beyond his control. But then cutting through the tension like a blade came the sound of sirens. The sirens grew louder, multiplying like an approaching storm, but Montgomery Hamilton's expression barely flickered. If anything, he looked mildly annoyed, like a man whose dinner reservation had been delayed by unexpected traffic. "Ah," he said, with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. "It seems Sheriff Dawson has decided to make this official after all. How theatrical." But as the police cars rounded the corner, not just Dawson's familiar cruiser, but 3 state police vehicles and what looked like an FBI sedan, Montgomery's confident demeanor began to show hairline cracks. Jake felt Grace tense beside him, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "This is it," she whispered so quietly only he could hear. "He's going to have us arrested. Sam will—" "Wait," Jake interrupted, studying the approaching vehicles with growing confusion. "Something's not right." The cars pulled into the gravel lot with military precision, but their positioning sent a clear message that Jake was struggling to interpret. Instead of boxing in Grace and Sam, they were surrounding Montgomery's SUVs, cutting off potential escape routes, with the kind of tactical awareness that spoke of careful planning. Sheriff Dawson emerged from the lead vehicle, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stepped a woman in a crisp FBI windbreaker, her badge catching the afternoon sunlight like a beacon. Behind them came more agents, their faces grim with the kind of professional intensity that suggested this was far more than a simple custody dispute. "Well, well," Montgomery murmured, his pale eyes calculating as he watched the federal agents deploy around his men. "This is an interesting development." The lead FBI agent, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, approached with the confident stride of someone holding all the cards. "Mr. Hamilton," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "I'm Special Agent Victoria Reeves, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." Montgomery's smile never wavered, but Jake noticed his hands had gone very still at his sides. "Agent Reeves, how delightful. Though I'm afraid this is rather poor timing. I'm in the middle of a family matter." "Actually, Mr. Hamilton, your family matters are exactly what we're here to discuss." Agent Reeves stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to speak conversationally, but far enough to maintain tactical advantage. "Specifically, we're interested in discussing some irregularities in the Hamilton Family Trust, certain offshore accounts, and what appears to be a rather extensive money laundering operation disguised as charitable donations." The words hit Montgomery like physical blows, though his expression remained carefully neutral. But Jake saw the way his eyes flicked toward his men, saw the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of a predator suddenly realizing it might be prey. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Montgomery said smoothly. "My family's financial arrangements are complex but entirely legal. Perhaps we could discuss this at a more appropriate time and place." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Agent Reeves replied. "You see, we've been investigating Hamilton Oil for quite some time now. Money laundering, tax evasion, bribery of foreign officials, connections to several rather unsavory regimes. The kind of investigation that requires years of careful documentation and airtight evidence." Grace made a small sound, half gasp, half laugh, and Jake realized she was hearing confirmation of suspicions she'd probably harbored for years. "The problem," Agent Reeves continued, "was that we could never quite connect you directly to the criminal activity. Shell companies trusted intermediaries, layers of plausible deniability. You're very good at keeping your hands clean, Mr. Hamilton." Montgomery's smile was beginning to look strained around the edges. "Agent Reeves, I'm sure you understand that a man in my position must rely on others to handle the day-to-day operations of a complex business enterprise. If there have been irregularities, I assure you, they occurred without my knowledge or consent." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong." Agent Reeves's smile was sharp as a blade. "You see, 6 months ago, your daughter-in-law here contacted our office with some very interesting information. Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of your direct involvement in activities that constitute multiple federal crimes." Jake felt the world tilt sideways as the implications hit him. Grace hadn't been running blindly, she'd been running towards something. The FBI. She'd been working with them all along. Montgomery's composure finally cracked, his pale eyes snapping toward Grace with naked fury. "You treacherous little—" "Careful, Mr. Hamilton," Agent Reeves warned. "Threatening a federal witness in front of multiple law enforcement officers wouldn't be advisable." Grace stepped forward, and Jake was amazed by the transformation that came over her. Gone was any trace of the frightened woman who'd been hiding in his garage for 3 weeks. In her place stood someone who radiated quiet strength and determination. "Hello, Montgomery," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Surprise?" "You've been playing a very dangerous game, Evelyn," Montgomery said, his cultured accent slipping just enough to reveal something harsher underneath. "One that could have consequences you haven't considered. Like the consequences Richard faced when he threatened to expose your operation," Grace shot back. "Like the brake lines that mysteriously failed on a car that had been serviced just days before." Montgomery's face went very still. "Be very careful about the accusations you make, my dear. Grief can make people say things they might regret." "The only thing I regret," Grace said with quiet fury, "is not having the courage to do this sooner. But I was scared and I was mourning, and I made the mistake of thinking you might actually have some shred of human decency when it came to your own grandson." Agent Reeves cleared her throat. "Mrs. Hamilton, perhaps we should focus on the matter at hand. Mr. Hamilton, you're under arrest for multiple violations of federal law, including money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder." The last charge hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jake felt his blood run cold as he realized the FBI wasn't just here about financial crimes, they were here about Richard's death. Montgomery's men had gone very still, their hands moving away from their jackets, in the universal gesture of people who suddenly found themselves outgunned and outnumbered. Whatever loyalty Montgomery commanded, it apparently didn't extend to going down with a sinking ship. "This is ridiculous," Montgomery said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I demand to speak with my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity," Agent Reeves assured him, "right after we read you your rights." As the FBI agents moved forward with handcuffs, Montgomery's gaze fell on Sam, who had been watching the proceedings with the wide-eyed fascination of a child witnessing something beyond his understanding. "Samuel," Montgomery called out, his voice taking on that practiced warmth again. "Remember what I told you about family loyalty. Remember that sometimes people we trust can disappoint us." "I remember," Sam said quietly. "I remember you hit Mama. I remember the man with the ring." Montgomery's face went white, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked truly shaken. "Samuel, you don't understand." "I understand," Sam interrupted with the kind of clarity that only children possessed. "You're a bad man, and bad men don't get to take little boys away from their mamas." The simple truth of it, delivered in a 5-year-old's voice, seemed to strip away the last of Montgomery's composure. As the FBI agents placed him in handcuffs, he looked less like an oil baron and more like what he'd always been underneath a bully whose power had finally been taken away. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes finding Grace's face. "You think the FBI can protect you forever? You think a federal witness program can keep you safe from everyone I know, everywhere? I have influence." "Actually," Agent Reeves said cheerfully, "we think it can, especially since you'll be spending the next 20 to 30 years in federal prison with no access to your assets, which have been frozen, pending the outcome of your trial." As Montgomery was led away to the waiting vehicles, Jake felt something shift in the air around them. Not just relief, but the kind of profound change that comes when a storm finally breaks and clears the sky. Grace sank down onto the steps leading to the apartment, her legs finally giving out under the weight of months of fear and adrenaline. Jake moved to sit beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to crowd her. "You've been working with the FBI this whole time," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. Richard had been gathering evidence against his father for months before he died. Financial records, recordings of phone calls, documentation of bribes and illegal deals. He hid it all in a safety deposit box that Montgomery didn't know about. And after Richard died, I was too scared to do anything at first. Montgomery had me convinced that I was crazy, that grief was making me paranoid. But then he started making moves to have me declared incompetent, and I realized he was never going to stop. So I contacted the FBI. Jake thought about the past 3 weeks, about Grace's nervous glances at every car that passed her careful rationing of cash, the way she jumped at every unexpected sound. But you really were running. The fear, the panic, that was all real. It was real, Grace confirmed. The FBI couldn't protect us until they had enough evidence to arrest Montgomery and his entire network. And Montgomery's people were getting closer every day. Agent Reeves told me to find somewhere safe to hide until they could move, but how do you hide from someone with unlimited resources? So you stole a car and drove until it ran out of gas. Grace's laugh was shaky but genuine. I'm not exactly criminal mastermind material. I was so scared I could barely think straight. When the car died, I just started walking with Sam, hoping we'd find somewhere, anywhere that might be safe. And you found us. I found you. Grace said, her voice soft with something that might have been wonder. I found this place where someone would help strangers in a storm, where a little girl would share her stuffed rabbit with a scared little boy, where a man would risk everything to protect people he'd known for 3 weeks. Jake felt heat creep up his neck. I didn't risk everything. You were willing to fight Montgomery Hamilton with a socket wrench, Grace interrupted. You were prepared to lose your business, your home, everything you'd built to protect Sam and me. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? Before Jake could respond, Agent Reeves approached her, expression businesslike but not unkind. Mrs. Hamilton, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss next steps. There will be depositions testimony, a trial that could last months. Are you prepared for that? Grace straightened her shoulders, and Jake saw the steel that had carried her through 6 months of running and hiding. I'm prepared for whatever it takes to make sure Montgomery never hurts anyone else's family. Good. We'll also need to discuss protection for you and Sam. Montgomery's network is extensive, and while most of his associates will distance themselves now that he's been arrested, there could still be threats. Jake felt his stomach clench at the thought of Grace and Sam disappearing into some federal protection program, becoming new people with new names in some distant city where he'd never see them again. Actually, Grace said slowly, I'd like to discuss that. I mean, Sam and I have been safe here for 3 weeks. Maybe. She trailed off, looking at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope, maybe, or fear that she was presuming too much. Agent Reeves followed Grace's gaze to Jake, her sharp eyes taking in the domestic scene around them. Emma showing Sam how to pet one of the baby rabbits that had wandered out of its house, the breakfast dishes still on the kitchen table visible through the open door, the obvious comfort and familiarity that had developed between them all. Mr. Morrison, Agent Reeves said, you understand that harboring federal witnesses could put you and your daughter at considerable risk. Jake looked at Emma laughing as Sam tried to convince a baby rabbit to sit still for petting. He thought about the past 3 weeks, about how his daughter had bloomed in the presence of other people who cared about her, about how Grace had filled spaces in their lives that he'd thought would remain empty forever. Agent Reeves, he said quietly. For the past 18 months, I've been playing it safe, making careful choices, avoiding risks, trying to protect what little I had left. And you know what I learned? Sometimes playing it safe is the most dangerous thing you can do because you end up protecting yourself right into a life that isn't worth living. Grace was staring at him now, and Jake could see tears gathering in her eyes. But these weren't tears of fear or desperation. They were something else entirely. What are you saying? She whispered. Jake took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, with no idea how deep the water below might be. I'm saying that Sam belongs here with you. I'm saying that you both belong here with us if that's what you want. I'm saying that maybe sometimes the most dangerous thing and the right thing are the same thing, and maybe that's okay. Agent Reeves looked between them with the expression of someone who'd seen too much of the world's ugliness and was surprised to encounter something genuinely good. Well, she said finally, I suppose it's possible to arrange protection in place. A new identity for Mrs. Hamilton and Sam enhanced security measures, regular check-ins with local law enforcement. What about Montgomery's trial? Grace asked. If I testify, won't that expose our location? Video testimony, sealed courtrooms, classified documents, Agent Reeves replied. We've protected witnesses in smaller towns than this before. The key is community cooperation. Sheriff Dawson, who had been standing quietly throughout the exchange, stepped forward. Jake tensed, remembering Montgomery's casual revelation that Dawson had sold them out. Agent Reeves, Dawson said, his voice gruff with what sounded like embarrassment. I owe these folks an apology. Montgomery Hamilton approached me weeks ago, told me he was looking for his kidnapped grandson. Offered me enough money to pay off my mortgage and send my youngest to college. Jake felt Grace go rigid beside him, but Dawson held up a hand. I took his money. Dawson continued, his weathered face flushed with shame. I'm not proud of it, but I took it. But when he showed up here today with those men talking about taking a child by force, I called the FBI. Agent Reeves had left me her card months ago, said to contact her if Montgomery ever showed up in my jurisdiction. You called the FBI? Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Dawson nodded. I may be a crooked small-town sheriff, but I'm not in the business of helping rich men steal children from their mothers. I've got grandkids of my own." Agent Reeves smiled. "Sheriff Dawson's call is actually what prompted us to move today. We'd been planning to arrest Montgomery at his Houston office next week, but when we learned he was making a play for Sam, we decided we couldn't wait." The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture that Jake was still struggling to fully comprehend. The cavalry hadn't arrived by chance, they'd been summoned by the same man who'd seemed to be Montgomery's ally. "There's something else," Agent Reeves said, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. "Mrs. Hamilton, you should know that with Montgomery's assets frozen and his criminal enterprise dismantled, the legitimate parts of your son's inheritance are considerable. Once the legal proceedings are complete, Sam will indeed be worth several $billion." Grace's face went pale. "I don't want his money. I never wanted any of it." "It's not Montgomery's money," Agent Reeves clarified gently. "It's Sam's inheritance from his father. Oil wells, real estate, holdings, legitimate business interests that Richard inherited from his grandmother's side of the family. Money that was never touched by Montgomery's criminal activities." Jake felt the ground shift beneath him as the implications sank in. Grace wasn't just a refugee from an abusive family situation. She was the mother of one of the wealthiest children in America. The kind of wealth that could buy small countries that came with responsibilities and pressures and dangers he couldn't begin to imagine. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. "For Sam, for Grace, for all of this." Grace turned to him, and in her eyes he saw the same fear that had been there when Montgomery's SUVs first pulled into his driveway. But this wasn't fear of physical danger. This was fear of losing something precious that she'd only just found. "It means," she said carefully, "that Sam will grow up with opportunities and responsibilities that most people can't imagine. It means there will always be people who want to use him, manipulate him, or hurt him for what he represents. And it means," Agent Reeves added, "that if you choose to stay here, you'll need security measures that go far beyond what we'd normally provide for federal witnesses. Armed guards, background checks for anyone who comes into contact with Sam, constant vigilance." Jake thought about the quiet life he'd been building in Millbrook, about the simple pleasures of teaching a child to use tools and sharing meals around a small kitchen table. Could any of that survive the kind of scrutiny and protection that would surround a billionaire heir? But then he looked at Sam, who was now sitting cross-legged in the dirt, letting a baby rabbit explore his lap, while Emma provided a running commentary on rabbit behavior and care. The boy looked happy, genuinely, unconsciously happy, in a way that Jake suspected he hadn't been for a very long time. "Sam," Jake called out, "come here for a minute, buddy." Sam carefully deposited the rabbit back in its house and trotted over his face, still bright with the joy of discovery. Grace pulled him close, her arms wrapping around him with the fierce protectiveness that had carried them through 6 months of running and hiding. "Sam," Jake said, crouching down to the boy's eye level, "some things are going to change. There are going to be people whose job it is to keep you safe, and rules about where you can go and who you can see. It might be different from how things have been here." Sam considered this with the seriousness that seemed to be his default approach to the world. "Will you still teach me about engines?" The question was so simple, so innocent, that Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was a child who'd just learned that his grandfather was going to prison, that his entire world was about to be turned upside down again, and his biggest concern was whether he'd still get to learn about carburetors and timing belts. "If you want me to," Jake said quietly. "If your mama thinks it's okay." Sam turned to Grace with questioning eyes. "Mama, can we stay? Can we keep living with Mr. Jake and Emma?" Grace looked at Jake, and in her eyes he saw a question that went far deeper than logistics and security arrangements. She was asking if he was truly prepared for what this would mean, not just the danger and the complexity, but the reality of building a life with someone whose world would never be simple or ordinary. Jake thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made at her graveside to take care of Emma and to live a life that would make their daughter proud. He thought about the past 18 months of careful, cautious survival, and about the past 3 weeks of remembering what it felt like to hope for something more than just making it through another day. Yes, he said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than he'd expected. Yes, we can stay. All of us. Grace's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, and when she leaned forward to kiss him, soft and grateful and full of promise, Jake felt something inside his chest that had been broken for 18 months finally click back into place. Well then, Agent Reeves said with evident satisfaction, I guess we have some paperwork to do. Emma, who had been watching the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone trying to decipher a foreign language, suddenly broke into a grin that could have powered the entire town. Does this mean Sam gets to stay forever? She asked. Does this mean Grace gets to be our family? Jake looked around at the unlikely group gathered in his garage. A FBI agent with a tablet full of financial documents. A sheriff counting his moral redemption in small-town currency. A woman and child who'd found safety in the last place anyone would think to look. And his own daughter, whose capacity for love seemed to expand exponentially when given the chance. Yeah, sweetheart, he said, pulling Emma into a hug that somehow included Grace and Sam as well. I think that's exactly what it means. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jake Morrison realized that sometimes the most extraordinary lives began with the most ordinary moments. A storm, a knock at the door, a decision to help strangers who turned out to be anything but strange. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, the life you thought you'd lost forever could be replaced by something even better. Something you'd never dared to imagine, but somehow always knew you were meant to find. 3 months after Montgomery Hamilton's arrest, Jake Morrison stood in his transformed garage and marveled at how completely his life had changed. What had once been a simple mechanic shop now housed something unprecedented, a state-of-the-art automotive training center that served the dual purpose of maintaining Jake's livelihood and providing Sam with the kind of education that money couldn't buy, the education of honest work and genuine accomplishment. The security measures were seamlessly integrated, but unmistakably present. Cameras disguised as standard shop equipment monitored every entrance, and Jake had grown accustomed to the discreet presence of federal agents who rotated through shifts posing as customers, or simply keeping watch from strategically positioned vehicles. It should have felt oppressive, this constant surveillance, but somehow it had become just another part of their new normal. Grace, now legally Sarah Grace Morrison, after a quiet courthouse wedding that had made headline news despite their efforts to keep it private, emerged from the small office she'd claimed as her own, carrying a stack of papers that represented her latest project. The Hamilton Foundation, as it had been renamed, was no longer a front for money laundering and political corruption. Under Grace's direction, it had become exactly what Montgomery had always claimed it was: a genuine force for good that funded education programs, rural healthcare initiatives, and environmental restoration projects across Texas and beyond. The Austin Children's Hospital proposal is ready for your review, Grace said, settling the papers on Jake's workbench with the satisfaction of someone who'd found meaningful work after years of feeling useless. Jake looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, a 1967 Mustang that belonged to Mrs. Henderson next door and had become a pet project for him and Sam. More surgery equipment. A new pediatric wing, actually, and funding for a specialized trauma unit. Grace's voice carried the quiet pride of someone who understood that money was only meaningful when it made a real difference in people's lives. Sam suggested it, actually. He said kids shouldn't have to be scared when they go to the hospital because the grown-ups don't have the right tools to help them. The observation was so perfectly Sam practical, compassionate, and wise beyond his 6 years that Jake felt the familiar warmth that came with being part of this unlikely family. Sam had grown 3 inches since coming to live with them permanently, and his face had lost the careful guardedness that had marked his early days. He was still serious for his age, still carried himself with the unconscious dignity that spoke of his complicated heritage, but now there was room in his seriousness for laughter, for curiosity, for the kind of childhood wonder that should never have been stolen from him in the first place. "Speaking of Sam," Jake said, glancing toward the house where the sound of children's voices drifted from the kitchen. "How did the appointment go this morning?" Dr. Catherine Mills had become a regular presence in their lives. Not as the court-appointed psychiatrist Montgomery had tried to use against Grace, but as a genuinely caring professional who specialized in helping children process trauma. Sam's sessions with her had evolved from necessary healing into something closer to regular check-ins with a trusted friend. "She says he's doing remarkably well." Grace reported, her relief evident in the way her shoulders relaxed. No signs of lasting psychological damage from everything that happened with Montgomery. She thinks the stability here, the sense of safety and belonging, has given him the foundation he needs to process what he experienced without being defined by it. Jake nodded, remembering his own sessions with Dr. Mills in the weeks following Montgomery's arrest. The psychiatrist had helped him understand that loving someone new didn't diminish his love for Sarah, that building a new life didn't dishonor the life he'd lost. The guilt that had shadowed him for 18 months hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more manageable, a gentle reminder to appreciate what he had rather than a crushing weight that made it impossible to move forward. "And what about you?" Jake asked, studying Grace's face for the subtle signs of stress that sometimes appeared when she thought no one was looking. "How are you handling all of this?" Grace considered the question seriously, as she always did. In the months since Montgomery's arrest, she'd had to testify in multiple proceedings, had faced scrutiny from media outlets that seemed determined to paint her either as a victim or a gold digger, and had navigated the complex process of rebuilding her identity as something more than just Montgomery Hamilton's daughter-in-law or Richard Hamilton's widow. "Some days are harder than others," she admitted. "Yesterday, I had a panic attack when I saw a black SUV at the grocery store. Turned out to be Mrs. Patterson getting groceries for her church social. But for about 10 minutes, I was right back to those first nights when every car that passed made me want to grab Sam and run." Jake set down his wrench and moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer comfort without crowding her. In the months since their hasty courthouse wedding, they'd learned to navigate the delicate geography of their relationship, built on genuine affection and mutual respect, but complicated by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "But then I came home," Grace continued, "and Emma was helping Sam with his math homework at the kitchen table, and you were humming while you cooked dinner. And I realized that this ordinary, wonderful, complicated life we've built, this is real in a way that nothing in my old life ever was." Before Jake could respond, the screen door slammed open with the particular violence that only Emma could achieve, and his daughter burst into the garage with the kind of urgent excitement that usually meant either catastrophic news or wonderful discovery. "Daddy, Grace, you have to come see what Sam did." Behind Emma, Sam appeared in the doorway with the slightly embarrassed expression of someone who'd been caught doing something unexpectedly impressive. In his hands, he carried what appeared to be a small wooden box carefully sanded and stained to a rich honey color. "I made it in shop class," Sam explained, his voice carrying the particular mix of pride and uncertainty that marked all his accomplishments. "Mr. Peterson helped me with the joints, but I did the sanding and the staining all by myself." Jake examined the box with the serious attention that Sam's projects always deserved. The craftsmanship was genuinely impressive: clean lines, smooth finish, and corners that met with the precision that spoke of careful measurement and patient work. "This is beautiful, buddy," Jake said, meaning it completely. "What's it for?" Sam's cheeks flushed pink. "It's for Emma. For her collection." Emma's collection was a constantly evolving assemblage of treasures that she'd been accumulating since Sarah's death: smooth stones from the creek behind their house, interesting leaves pressed between the pages of old books, feathers from various birds, and photographs that captured moments she wanted to remember forever. It had started as a way of coping with loss and had evolved into a celebration of the beauty she found in everyday life. "Sam," Emma breathed, accepting the box with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever made for me." The simple honesty of her response made Sam's face light up with the kind of pure happiness that made all the complicated security arrangements and court proceedings seem worthwhile. This was what they were protecting: not just a billionaire heir, but a little boy who made wooden boxes for his sister and worried about scared children in hospitals. "There's something else," Sam said, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that usually preceded his most important announcements. "I was thinking, maybe we could make something for the baby rabbits, like a bigger house with rooms for when they get bigger." The rabbit population had indeed grown despite Jake's efforts to relocate the original family to a more suitable habitat. What had started as 7 babies had become a small community that Emma had named and Sam had claimed responsibility for feeding and protecting. "That sounds like a perfect summer project," Grace said, ruffling Sam's dark hair with the casual affection that had developed between them over months of shared bedtime stories and scraped knee bandaging and the 1,000 small intimacies that made a family. The summer in question was approaching with the kind of significance that marked true endings and beginnings. Emma would be finishing 2nd grade. Sam would be starting 1st grade in Millbrook Elementary's new security-enhanced environment, and Jake would be celebrating the 1st anniversary of the night that had changed everything. But first, there was Montgomery's trial to get through. The proceeding had been delayed multiple times as prosecutors built their case, and Montgomery's high-powered legal team exhausted every possible avenue of appeal and obstruction. But finally, next month, Grace would take the stand to testify about the financial crimes she'd witnessed, the threats she'd endured, and the fear that had driven her to steal a car and flee into a Texas thunderstorm with her unconscious son in her arms. "Agent Reeves called this morning," Grace said quietly, her voice taking on the careful neutrality she used when discussing anything related to Montgomery. "The trial starts in 6 weeks. She wants to do a final prep session next week." Jake felt his stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety that accompanied any mention of Montgomery's ongoing legal proceedings. Not because he feared for their physical safety, the security arrangements were comprehensive, and the man himself was in federal custody without possibility of bail, but because he knew how much the process cost Grace emotionally, how each deposition and hearing required her to relive the worst moments of her life. "You don't have to testify in person," Jake reminded her gently. Agent Reeves said video testimony was still an option. "I know," Grace replied, "but I want to. I want Montgomery to see my face when I tell the jury What he did to his own son, what he tried to do to Sam. I want him to understand that he didn't break me, that running away was the bravest thing I've ever done, not the act of a mentally unstable woman. The steel in her voice reminded Jake of the woman who'd stood up to Montgomery in his garage 3 months ago, who'd spent 6 months gathering evidence while living in terror, who'd made the impossible choice to trust strangers with her son's life. Grace had been transformed by their life together, but she'd also revealed strength that had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. "We'll be there," Jake said simply. "Emma and Sam and me. In the courthouse, in the gallery where you can see us. You won't be alone." Grace's smile was soft with gratitude, and something deeper, the kind of love that had grown slowly and steadily from shared challenges and mutual respect, and the gradual realization that they'd found in each other exactly what they'd needed, even if it wasn't what they'd expected. "I know," she said. "That's what makes all the difference." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Dawson, whose relationship with their family had evolved from suspicious authority figure to something closer to protective uncle. The guilt he'd carried over taking Montgomery's money had transformed into a fierce determination to make amends, and he'd become one of Sam's most enthusiastic supporters and Emma's most reliable source of stories about the old days when Millbrook was even smaller and more isolated than it was now. "Afternoon, folks," Dawson said, removing his hat as he entered the garage. "Just wanted to let you know we had a visitor this morning. Reporter from the Houston Chronicle asking questions about the Hamilton boy and whether it was true he was living in Millbrook." Jake felt Grace tense beside him. They'd managed to keep Sam's location relatively private, despite the media attention surrounding Montgomery's arrest, but determined journalists had been gradually piecing together clues about where the Hamilton heir had disappeared to. "What did you tell him?" Grace asked. "Told him I had no idea what he was talking about," Dawson replied with satisfaction. "Told him the only Hamiltons I knew were the Hamilton who used to run the hardware store before he retired to Florida, and as far as I knew, they didn't have any children. It wasn't technically a lie. Sam's legal name was now Samuel Morrison, adopted through an expedited process that had been facilitated by his status as a federal witness and his biological father's documented wish to distance his son from Montgomery's influence." "Think he believed you?" Jake asked. Dawson's grin was sharp as broken glass. "Hard to say, but he seemed real interested in checking out the fishing opportunities at Lake Powell, about 40 miles south of here. Mentioned he might stick around for a few days to see what he could catch." The message was clear. The reporter had been redirected away from Millbrook, at least temporarily. But it was also a reminder that their privacy was fragile, dependent on the goodwill of people like Dawson and the small-town instinct to protect their own from outside interference. "Sheriff," Sam said suddenly, his voice carrying the serious tone he used when he was about to ask an important question. "Do you think my grandfather will go to prison for a long time?" The question hung in the air like smoke. They'd tried to shield Sam from the details of Montgomery's crimes, but he was too intelligent and too observant to be completely protected from the reality of what his grandfather had done. Dawson crouched down to Sam's eye level, his weathered face gentle with the kind of careful honesty that children deserved. "Son, your grandfather did some very bad things. He hurt people, he broke laws that exist to protect folks like your mama and you. When grown-ups do things like that, they have to face consequences." "But he's old," Sam said quietly. "And he's my daddy's daddy." "That's true," Dawson agreed. "And I imagine that makes this real confusing for you. But Sam being somebody's grandfather doesn't give you the right to hurt people. Being rich doesn't give you the right to break laws. And being family doesn't mean you get to scare the people you're supposed to protect." Sam considered this with the gravity that marked all his processing of adult concepts. So he'll be in jail? Most likely yes, for a long time. Good, Sam said with startling firmness. I don't want him to hurt anyone else's mama. The simple moral clarity of the statement, devoid of sentimentality or confusion about family loyalty, reminded Jake that Sam had experienced Montgomery's true nature firsthand. To him, his grandfather wasn't a complex figure deserving of sympathy, but simply a dangerous man who'd made his mother cry and his life into a series of emergency escapes. After Dawson left, the afternoon settled into the comfortable routine that had become their family rhythm. Grace returned to her foundation work, coordinating with hospitals and schools and environmental groups that were learning to trust that the Hamilton money came without strings or hidden agendas. Jake and Sam worked together on Mrs. Henderson's Mustang, the boy's small hands steady and careful, as he helped his adoptive father navigate the intricate machinery that made cars run. Emma divided her attention between homework and rabbit supervision, her latest project being a detailed behavioral study that she insisted would be valuable for science class. Though Jake suspected she simply enjoyed having an excuse to sit in the dirt and observe the small creatures that had made their backyard into a thriving ecosystem. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Jake of the storm that had brought Grace and Sam into their lives, he found himself marveling at the ordinary miracle of it all. This was what happiness looked like. He realized not the dramatic highs and lows of movie romance, but the steady satisfaction of shared work and mutual care, and the gradual accumulation of small moments that added up to a life worth living. The realization was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming outside, followed by the familiar voices of Agent Reeves and her partner, Agent Martinez. Their visits had become less frequent as the months passed and the immediate danger receded, but they still checked in regularly, partly for security reasons, and partly because they'd become genuinely fond of the family they'd helped to protect. "Evening, folks," Agent Reeves called out as she entered the garage. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." "Just the usual chaos," Jake replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What brings you by?" Agent Reeves's expression was more serious than usual, and Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest. After months of relative calm, had something changed? Had Montgomery's lawyers found a new avenue of attack? Had some threat emerged that they hadn't anticipated? "We got word from the prosecutor's office today," Agent Reeves said without preamble. "Montgomery Hamilton's legal team has approached them about a plea bargain." Grace, who had been organizing paperwork at Jake's desk, went very still. "What kind of plea bargain?" "Full confession to the financial crimes in exchange for dropping the murder charges related to your husband's death," Agent Martinez explained. 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 15 years. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Jake watched Grace's face cycle through a dozen emotions: relief that Montgomery would be imprisoned, anger that he might escape accountability for Richard's death, fear that 25 years might not be enough to keep Sam safe. "What does that mean for us?" Grace asked quietly. "For the trial, for our testimony." "If Montgomery takes the plea, there won't be a trial," Agent Reeves replied. "Your testimony would no longer be needed. The financial evidence is strong enough that the prosecution is confident the plea arrangement would stick." Jake realized he was holding his breath. No trial meant no media circus, no months of reliving the worst moments of Grace's life, no risk that Montgomery's lawyers would find some way to turn the proceedings into an attack on Grace's fitness as a mother. But it also meant that Montgomery would never be held fully accountable for Richard's death, never face the complete consequences of his actions. 25 years, Grace murmured. "He'll be in his 80s when he gets out. If he gets out." "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Reeves said gently. The decision isn't yours to make, but the prosecutor wanted your input before responding to the plea offer. This has been your fight more than anyone's. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from the FBI agents to Jake to the doorway where Emma and Sam had appeared, drawn by the serious tone of adult conversation. Can I think about it? She asked finally. Can I have tonight to decide? Of course, Agent Martinez assured her. The prosecutor doesn't need an answer until tomorrow afternoon. After the agents left, the family gathered around the kitchen table for a dinner that felt more solemn than usual. Grace picked at her food, lost in thought, while Jake tried to fill the silence with conversation about summer plans and upcoming projects. Emma and Sam seemed to sense the weight of whatever decision was pending their usual chatter, replaced by the kind of careful quiet that children used when they knew something important was happening, but didn't understand what. It wasn't until after the children were in bed, after the dishes were washed, and the house had settled into its evening stillness, that Grace finally spoke about what she was thinking. I keep wondering what Richard would want, she said, curled against Jake's side on the small couch that had become their evening refuge. Would he want Montgomery to spend the rest of his life in prison? Or would he want us to be free from all of this, to move on without the trial hanging over us? Jake stroked her hair, marveling at how it caught the lamplight like spun gold. What do you want? I want Sam to grow up without the shadow of his grandfather's crimes following him everywhere, Grace said without hesitation. I want Emma to have a normal senior year of high school, not one where reporters are camping outside our house trying to get quotes about the Hamilton trial. I want us to be a family defined by what we've built together, not by what we've survived. Then you have your answer, Jake said gently. Grace was quiet for a moment longer, then lifted her head to look at him with eyes that held the kind of peace that came from making a difficult decision with clear conscience. 25 years is a long time, she said. Long enough for Sam to grow up safe to become the man his father hoped he'd be. Long enough for us to build something that can't be taken away by anyone, no matter how much money or power they have. The next afternoon, Grace called Agent Reeves to inform the prosecutor that she supported the plea arrangement. Montgomery Hamilton would plead guilty to multiple federal crimes and spend the next quarter-century in federal prison, his empire dismantled, and his ability to hurt anyone else permanently ended. 2 weeks later, the plea was formally entered, and the case that had dominated headlines for months disappeared from the news cycle with surprising speed. Montgomery Hamilton became just another wealthy criminal serving time for financial crimes, his name gradually fading from public consciousness as newer scandals captured media attention. For the Morrison family, the end of legal proceedings marked the beginning of something unprecedented, a completely normal life. Sam started first grade that fall with the kind of excitement that only children could bring to new experiences. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been briefed on his unique situation, but treated him with the same mixture of affection and mild exasperation she showed all her students. He made friends easily, his natural seriousness balanced by a dry sense of humor that reminded Jake of Grace and a willingness to help others that spoke to his fundamental decency. Emma flourished in her role as big sister, taking Sam under her wing with the protective instinct that had emerged as soon as she'd decided he belonged to their family. She helped him navigate the social complexities of elementary school, taught him the best places to find interesting rocks on the playground, and shared her extensive knowledge of rabbit behavior with anyone willing to listen. Grace threw herself into the foundation work with the passion of someone who'd finally found meaningful purpose. Under her leadership, the Hamilton Foundation became known for its innovative approaches to education and healthcare funding programs that made real differences in communities across the Southwest. She traveled frequently for site visits and board meetings, but always returned home with stories about the people they were helping and ideas for new projects that could amplify their impact. Jake expanded the garage into a full-scale automotive training center, offering classes for high school students who wanted to learn practical skills and adults who needed new careers. The work was satisfying in ways that went beyond financial success. He was teaching people to support themselves, to understand the machinery that surrounded them, to take pride in honest work done well. But perhaps most importantly, they became a family in the truest sense of the word. Not because of shared DNA or legal documents, but because of choice, renewed daily love demonstrated through small kindnesses, and the gradual understanding that they'd found in each other exactly what they'd needed to heal from their respective losses. One evening in late spring, nearly a year after Montgomery's plea had been entered, Jake found himself sitting on the front steps of their house watching Emma and Sam play with the rabbits in the gathering dusk. Grace emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee and settled beside him with the comfortable ease of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, offering him one of the cups. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that had become one of the small luxuries of their shared life. "I was thinking about Sarah," he said quietly. Grace didn't tense or pull away as she might have in the early days of their relationship. Instead, she moved closer, offering the wordless comfort of her presence. "What about her?" Grace asked gently. Jake considered the question, searching for words to describe the complex emotions that Sarah's memory evoked now. The sharp edge of grief had softened over time, transformed into something closer to gratitude for what they'd shared and what her love had taught him about the kind of man he wanted to be. "I was thinking she would have liked you," he said finally. "She would have liked how you make Emma laugh, how you never try to replace her, but somehow make her memory feel more present, not less. She would have loved watching you and Sam figure out how to be a family." Grace's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the naturalness that marked all their small intimacies. "I wish I could have met her." "You would have been friends," Jake said with certainty. "She had the same stubborn streak you do, the same inability to ignore injustice, the same way of making everyone around her feel like they mattered." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children play in the dying light. Emma was explaining something elaborate to Sam, her hands gesturing dramatically, while he listened with the serious attention he brought to all her pronouncements. The rabbits had multiplied again, despite Jake's periodic attempts at population control, and their yard now hosted what Emma insisted on calling a rabbit metropolis. "Jake," Grace said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been nervousness. "There's something I want to talk to you about." Jake felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. After everything they'd been through, unexpected conversations still made him brace for bad news. "What is it?" Grace turned to face him fully, her expression serious, but not fearful. "No. Mills says Sam is ready to learn more about his inheritance, about what it will mean when he turns 21. She thinks it's important for him to start understanding his responsibilities gradually, rather than having it all dumped on him at once." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure where the conversation was heading. They'd always known this day would come, the day when Sam would need to begin preparing for the immense responsibility that awaited him. "But the thing is," Grace continued, "I don't want him to carry that burden alone. I want him to understand that having money means having the power to help people, but I also want him to know that the most important things in life aren't things money can buy." "He knows that already," Jake said gently. "Look at him, he's more excited about rabbit houses than he is about inheriting oil wells." Grace smiled, but her expression remained serious. "I want to make that official. I want to set up a trust that ensures Sam will never have to make financial decisions alone, that there will always be people who love him for who he is not what he's worth involved in managing his inheritance. Jake still wasn't sure what Grace was asking of him, but something in her tone suggested this was more than just financial planning. "I want you to be his co-trustee," Grace said quietly. "I want his inheritance to be managed by people who understand that money is just a tool, that the real wealth is what we've built here, this family, this life, this understanding that we're all responsible for taking care of each other." The magnitude of what she was asking hit Jake like a physical blow. Co-trustee of a multi-billion-dollar inheritance meant responsibility beyond anything he'd ever imagined, decision-making power that could affect thousands of lives, a role that would tie him to Sam and Grace in ways that went far beyond marriage vows or adoption papers. "Grace," he said carefully, "I don't know anything about managing that kind of money. I'm a mechanic who barely keeps his own books straight." "But you know about integrity," Grace replied firmly. "You know about making decisions based on what's right, not what's profitable. You know about protecting people who need protecting and standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they are." Jake looked at Sam, who was now trying to coax a particularly adventurous rabbit to sit still for petting. The boy had no idea that his casual Saturday evening was being shaped by conversations about trusts and inheritance and the weight of responsibility that would someday rest on his shoulders. "What does Sam think about all this?" Jake asked. "We haven't talked to him about the details yet," Grace admitted. "But yesterday he asked me if you were going to be his dad forever, or just until he grew up. When I told him forever, he said, 'Good, because I want him to help me decide what to do with Grandpa's money when I'm old enough.'" The simple faith in Sam's words, the assumption that Jake would be there, would help guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead, made Jake's throat tight with emotion. "He calls it Grandpa's money," Jake observed. "I know. Dr. Mills says that's healthy. He understands it came from his grandfather, but he doesn't think of it as defining who he is. To him, it's just something he'll need to deal with someday, like learning to drive or choosing a college." Jake imagined Sam at 21 hopefully still carrying that same matter-of-fact approach to extraordinary circumstances. He thought about the kind of man the boy was already becoming: thoughtful, generous, unimpressed by wealth, but committed to using whatever resources he had to help others. "Okay," Jake said quietly. Okay, I'll do it. I'll be his co-trustee, help him figure out how to manage all that money responsibly, but on one condition." Grace raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "We raise him exactly the way we've been raising him. No fancy schools unless he wants them, no special treatment because he's rich, no different rules because he's going to inherit billions someday. He gets to be a normal kid who happens to have extraordinary resources." Grace's smile was radiant. "Deal." They shook hands with mock seriousness, then dissolved into laughter at the absurdity of negotiating billion-dollar trust arrangements while sitting on their front steps in small-town Texas. As if summoned by their laughter, Emma and Sam abandoned their rabbit observation to join them on the steps. Emma curled up against Grace's side while Sam leaned against Jake's shoulder, both children tired and happy from their evening of exploration. "What were you guys talking about?" Emma asked with the casual nosiness that marked her approach to adult conversations. "Boring, grown-up stuff," Grace replied. "Money and responsibility and making sure everyone in our family is taken care of." "Are we rich?" Sam asked with the directness that characterized all his important questions. Jake and Grace exchanged glances over the children's heads. They'd been dreading this conversation, but somehow it felt right to have it here on their front steps with the rabbits grazing peacefully in their yard and the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Yes," Grace said simply. "You're going to inherit a lot of money someday, Sam. More money than most people can imagine." Sam considered this information with his usual gravity. What am I supposed to do with all that money? Whatever you think is right, Jake said. Help people who need help. Fix problems that need fixing. Make the world a little better than it was when you found it. That's a lot of responsibility, Emma observed. That's why he won't have to handle it alone, Grace assured her. That's why he'll have family to help him make good decisions. Sam looked up at Jake with those serious brown eyes. Will you really help me even when I'm grown up? For as long as you want me to, Jake promised. For as long as I'm able. The conversation drifted to other topics. Plans for summer vacation. Emma's ongoing research into rabbit communication, Sam's desire to learn how to change oil in addition to his existing socket wrench skills. But underneath the ordinary chatter, Jake sensed a shift in their family dynamic. They were no longer just four people who'd found each other by accident and learned to care for each other out of necessity. They were a unit bound by choice and commitment and shared responsibility for something larger than themselves. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its familiar stillness, Jake found himself standing in the doorway to Sam's room. The boy slept sprawled across his bed with the complete abandon that belonged to childhood, one arm hanging off the mattress, and his dark hair tousled against the pillow. It was hard to reconcile this sleeping child with the future he represented, the billions of dollars, the corporate boardrooms, the power to influence policy and shape the future of entire industries. But perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Perhaps the world needed more leaders who remembered what it felt like to build rabbit houses and get excited about socket wrenches and measure their worth by the people who loved them rather than the money they controlled. Grace appeared beside him in the doorway, her presence warm and familiar in the darkness. "Second thoughts," she whispered. "About which part? Any of it. All of it. Taking on responsibility for more money than either of us can actually comprehend." Jake considered the question seriously. 3 years ago, if someone had told him he'd be standing in his house planning the management of $1 billion inheritance for his adopted son, he'd have suggested professional help. His world had been so small, then bounded by grief and survival, and the simple goal of getting Emma safely to adulthood. Now his world had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined, filled with federal agents and foundation work and security arrangements, and the weight of responsibility for a child whose decisions would someday affect thousands of lives. "No second thoughts," he said quietly. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be." Grace leaned against his shoulder, and Jake felt the deep contentment that came from knowing, without any doubt, that he was exactly where he belonged. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that reminded Jake of the day Grace and Sam had first appeared in his life, he stood in the same garage where it had all begun and marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed exactly the same. The garage was busier now, filled with students learning automotive repair and adults retraining for new careers. Grace's office occupied a corner of the building where she managed foundation business and coordinated with the growing network of programs they supported. The security measures were so seamlessly integrated that visitors rarely noticed them, but Jake never forgot they were there, a reminder that the peace they'd built was precious and required constant vigilance to maintain. Sam, now 7 and in 2nd grade, burst through the door with the kind of excitement that usually meant either wonderful news or impending disaster. Mr. Jake, guess what happened at school today?" Jake looked up from the engine he was rebuilding with one of his adult students, a woman named Maria, who'd been laid off from the textile plant and was learning automotive repair as a path to new employment. "What happened, buddy?" "Mrs. Rodriguez says I can be in the spelling bee," And if I win the school spelling bee, I get to go to the county spelling bee, and if I win that, I might get to go to the state spelling bee. The unbridled enthusiasm in Sam's voice reminded Jake that despite everything the boy had experienced, despite the weight of his future inheritance and the complexity of his past, he was still fundamentally a 7-year-old who could get excited about spelling competitions. "That's fantastic," Jake said, genuinely proud. "Have you told your mama?" "She's in Austin meeting with the hospital people, but I called her, and she said she's going to buy me a dictionary when she gets home so I can practice." Emma, now in 4th grade and serving as Sam's unofficial academic coach, appeared in the doorway. "I can help you practice," she offered. "I was really good at spelling when I was your age." The casual superiority in her voice made Jake smile. At 10, Emma had developed the confidence that came from being the older sibling, the one who knew the ropes and could guide newcomers through the complexities of elementary school life. "Will you really?" Sam asked, his excitement obvious. "Will you help me learn all the hard words?" "Of course," Emma replied with the magnanimity of someone granting a great favor. "That's what big sisters are for." Jake felt the familiar warmth that came from watching his children, and they were both his children now in every way that mattered, navigate their relationship with the easy affection that had developed over 2 years of shared experiences. Maria, who had been observing this family interaction with the kind of wistful expression that suggested her own children were grown and gone, smiled as she returned to her work on the carburetor they'd been rebuilding. "You've got good kids," she said quietly. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "I really do." The afternoon proceeded with the comfortable rhythm that had become their family norm. Students came and went, learning skills that would serve them for years to come. Grace called to check in from Austin, where she was finalizing funding for a new children's wing that would serve rural communities across 3 counties. Emma and Sam did homework at the small table Jake had set up in the corner of the garage, their heads bent together over math problems and reading assignments. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in the familiar shades of orange and pink that Jake had come to associate with endings and beginnings, Agent Reeves made one of her increasingly rare appearances. "Evening, everyone," she called out as she entered the garage. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just the usual chaos," Jake replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What brings you by?" Agent Reeves's expression was more relaxed than Jake had seen it in months. "Actually, this is a social call, and to deliver some news I thought you'd want to hear." Grace, who had returned from Austin an hour earlier, looked up from the foundation paperwork she'd been reviewing. "What kind of news?" "Montgomery Hamilton died in federal prison yesterday," Agent Reeves said without preamble. "Heart attack. Prison medical staff tried to revive him, but he was declared dead at 3:47 p.m. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Jake felt Grace go very still beside him, her face cycling through a dozen emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and something that might have been closure. "How do you feel about that?" Agent Reeves asked gently. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving to Sam and Emma, who were pretending to do homework while obviously listening to every word of the adult conversation. "I feel sorry for him," Grace said finally, her voice thoughtful rather than emotional. "I feel sorry that he spent his whole life accumulating power and money and never learned what actually mattered. I feel sorry that he died in prison surrounded by strangers, instead of being the kind of grandfather Sam could have loved and respected." She paused, considering her words carefully. "But mostly I feel grateful that Sam will never have to worry about him again, that we can build our future without looking over our shoulders, without wondering if Montgomery might find some way to reach us, even from prison." Jake reached for Grace's hand, their fingers intertwining with the naturalness that marked all their gestures of comfort and support. What happens now? Jake asked. With the estate, with the legal arrangements. Nothing changes for you, Agent Reeves assured them. Montgomery's death doesn't affect Sam's inheritance or the trust arrangements you've established. If anything, it simplifies things. There's no longer any possibility of appeals or attempts to regain control of the Hamilton assets. Sam, who had been listening with the serious attention he brought to all important conversations, looked up from his homework. Does this mean I don't have to worry about my grandfather anymore? He asked quietly. Grace moved to kneel beside his chair, her expression gentle but honest. Yes, sweetheart. It means you're completely safe now. It means we can live our life without being afraid of anyone trying to take you away from us. Sam considered this information with his usual gravity, then surprised everyone by asking, "Can we have a funeral for him?" Grace blinked in surprise. "A funeral?" "Sam, honey, your grandfather did some very bad things. He hurt people, including us." "I know," Sam said quietly, "but he was still my daddy's daddy. And Emma told me that when people die, even if they weren't very good people, sometimes their families say goodbye anyway." Jake looked at Emma, who had the slightly embarrassed expression of someone whose philosophical observations had been quoted at an inconvenient moment. "I was telling him about Great-Uncle Frank," Emma explained. "How even though he was mean to everyone and nobody really liked him, we still went to his funeral, because Mama said that's what families do." The wisdom of children, Jake reflected, often cut through adult complications with startling clarity. Sam wasn't suggesting they mourn Montgomery or celebrate his life. He was simply recognizing that death marked an ending that deserved acknowledgement, even when that death brought relief rather than grief. "You know what?" Grace said slowly. "I think that's a very mature and generous idea. We could have a small service, just our family, to say goodbye and to honor your father's memory." And so 3 days later, the Morrison family gathered in the small cemetery where Sarah was buried, not to mourn Montgomery Hamilton, but to mark the end of a chapter that had shaped their lives in ways both terrible and miraculous. The service was simple. Grace spoke briefly about forgiveness and the importance of choosing love over hatred. Jake read a passage from a book about second chances that Emma had selected, and Sam placed a single white flower on an empty patch of ground, while saying a quiet goodbye to the grandfather who might have been. As they walked back to their car, Sam slipped his hand into Jake's with the easy affection that had developed between them over 2 years of shared bedtime stories and homework help, and the 1,000 small moments that made a father-son relationship. "Mr. Jake," Sam said quietly. "What is it, buddy? I'm glad you found us in the storm." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Me too, Sam. Me too." The months that followed Montgomery's death brought a sense of freedom that none of them had quite realized they'd been missing. Without the shadow of potential threat hanging over their lives, they were able to fully embrace the simple pleasures of ordinary family life. Emma flourished in 5th grade, her natural leadership abilities and quick wit making her popular with classmates and teachers alike. She'd grown 3 inches since Grace and Sam had arrived, and her face was beginning to lose its childish roundness, hinting at the young woman she was becoming. Sam excelled in 3rd grade, his careful seriousness balanced by a growing confidence and sense of humor that reminded Jake of Grace. He'd won the school spelling bee and placed 3rd in the county competition, an achievement that had made Emma almost as proud as Grace and Jake. Grace's foundation work had expanded beyond their wildest expectations. The Hamilton Foundation now supported dozens of programs across the Southwest, from rural healthcare clinics to environmental restoration projects, to educational initiatives that were making real differences in communities that had been largely forgotten by larger organizations. Jake's Automotive Training Center had become a regional destination for people seeking practical skills and new career opportunities. He'd hired 2 additional instructors and was planning an expansion that would double their capacity. But perhaps most importantly, they'd achieved something that had once seemed impossible. They'd become completely unremarkably normal. The security measures were still in place, the financial arrangements were still complex, and Sam's inheritance still represented resources beyond most people's imagination. But day to day, they were simply a family dealing with homework and household chores, planning vacations and managing the endless logistics of raising children, supporting each other through good days and bad days, and the 1,000 ordinary moments that make up a life. On a warm evening in late spring, almost 3 years after that first thunderstorm had brought Grace and Sam into their lives, Jake found himself once again sitting on the front steps of their house watching his children play in the yard. The rabbit population had reached what Emma called optimal sustainability, and Sam had built an elaborate network of houses and tunnels that looked like a miniature suburban development. Grace emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just finished a particularly challenging project. "The Denver Children's Hospital just approved our proposal," she announced, settling beside Jake with the comfortable ease of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "The new trauma center?" Jake asked, accepting his coffee gratefully. "Complete with the specialized equipment Sam suggested, and the family support services Emma recommended." Grace's smile was radiant with pride and accomplishment. "They're naming it the Richard Hamilton Memorial Wing." Jake felt a surge of satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. The foundation work wasn't just about spending money, it was about creating lasting change that would improve lives for generations to come. "Richard would be proud," Jake said quietly. "He would," Grace agreed. "He would be proud of what we've built, what Sam is becoming, how we've turned his father's legacy into something good." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Emma and Sam debate the merits of various architectural improvements to the rabbit metropolis. The children had grown so much in the past 3 years, not just physically, but in confidence and security, and the kind of deep happiness that came from knowing they were loved and valued for exactly who they were. "Jake," Grace said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been nervousness. Jake felt a flicker of the old anxiety, though he knew rationally that their lives were more stable now than they'd ever been. "What is it?" Grace turned to face him fully, her expression serious, but not fearful. "I want to have another baby." The words hit Jake like a lightning bolt, unexpected and illuminating, and slightly overwhelming all at once. In 3 years of building their family, of navigating the complexities of blending their lives and raising their children, they'd never discussed the possibility of adding to their number. "Another baby," Jake repeated, making sure he'd heard correctly. "I know it's complicated," Grace said quickly. "I know there would be security considerations and logistical challenges and all sorts of things we'd need to figure out. But Jake, I watch you with Emma and Sam, and I see how much love you have to give. I watch our children together, and I see how much they'd love having a little brother or sister to protect and teach and care for." Jake tried to process what Grace was asking, what she was offering. Another child, a baby who would be theirs from the beginning, who would grow up knowing nothing but love and security and the kind of family bond they'd worked so hard to create. "What brought this on?" he asked gently. Grace's smile was soft with memory. Yesterday, when Sam was helping Mrs. Henderson in her garden, she told him he was the kindest little boy she'd ever known. And he said, "Emma taught me about kindness, and Mr. Jake taught me about helping people, and Mama taught me about taking care of things that are smaller than me." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. The idea that Sam saw himself as the beneficiary of their collective love and wisdom, that he understood his role in their family as both recipient and giver of care, spoke to the depth of the bonds they'd forged. And then he asked me, Grace continued, if we were going to have more kids because he thought he'd be really good at being a big brother, just like Emma is good at being a big sister. The image of Sam as a protective older brother teaching a younger sibling about rabbit care and socket wrenches and the importance of kindness made Jake's chest warm with possibility. What did you tell him? I told him that was something all four of us would need to talk about together, Grace replied. But Jake, the look on his face, the hope and excitement, it made me realize how much I want that too. How much I want to give our children the experience of watching a family grow, of being part of something that gets bigger and stronger instead of smaller and more fragile. Jake thought about his life 3 years ago, bounded by grief and survival, and the constant fear that he wasn't enough for Emma, that his love and care couldn't possibly replace what she'd lost when Sarah died. He thought about how that small, careful world had expanded beyond recognition, filled with laughter and purpose, and the kind of deep contentment he'd thought was lost forever. How do you think Emma and Sam would feel about it? He asked. Why don't we ask them? Grace called the children over, and they approached with the slightly wary expression that meant they suspected an important conversation was about to happen. What's wrong? Emma asked immediately. Did somebody do something bad? Is there a problem with the foundation? Are we in trouble? Nothing's wrong, Grace assured her quickly. We wanted to talk to you about something good. Something exciting. Sam settled cross-legged in the grass in front of them, his serious brown eyes moving between his parents' faces as if trying to read the nature of the surprise. Your mama and I have been talking, Jake said carefully, about our family, about how happy we've been together, about how much we love being your parents. And we were wondering, Grace continued, how you'd feel about having a little brother or sister, a baby. Emma's eyes went wide with the kind of shock that could indicate either delight or horror. Sam's face lit up with unmistakable joy. A real baby, Sam asked. Like a tiny baby that we'd get to help take care of. A real baby, Grace confirmed. One who would be part of our family from the very beginning. Emma, who had been processing this information with her characteristic thoroughness, suddenly broke into a grin that could have powered the entire town. Yes, she said with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for Christmas morning. Yes, 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 I've always wanted a little brother or sister. I have so much I could teach them. Sam was practically bouncing with excitement. I could show them how to build rabbit houses, and how to help in the garage, and how to be brave when there's thunder. The children's immediate and wholehearted enthusiasm made Jake's decision easy. This was what family looked like, not just the four of them, but the ever-expanding circle of love and care and mutual support that could grow to encompass anyone who needed belonging. So that's a yes from both of you? Jake asked, though the answer was obvious. That's a yes, Emma declared, speaking for both children. When can we have the baby? Can we get started right away? Grace laughed, the sound bright and joyful and full of possibility. These things take time, sweetheart. But yes, we can get started. As the children ran off to share the news with the rabbits, who they insisted should be among the first to know, Jake pulled Grace close, marveling at how their conversation had transformed the evening from ordinary to extraordinary with a few simple words. Are you sure about this? He asked, though he already knew the answer from the radiance in her eyes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Grace replied. Well, except maybe the decision to trust a stranger in a thunderstorm 3 years ago. The baby Margaret Sarah Morrison, named for both her grandmothers, was born on a crisp October morning, exactly 9 months later. Emma and Sam, now 11 and 8 respectively, proved to be devoted older siblings, who treated their baby sister with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. Jake held his new daughter for the first time in the same hospital room, where he'd once held Emma as a newborn, marveling at how different this experience felt. Where Emma's birth had been shadowed by uncertainty and the weight of new responsibility, Maggie's arrival felt like pure celebration, the completion of something they'd been building together for years. Grace, exhausted but radiant, watched Jake cradle their daughter with the soft smile of someone who'd found exactly what she'd been hoping for. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. Jake looked at the tiny face surrounded by dark hair that already showed signs of Grace's distinctive curl, at the small hands that would someday learn to use socket wrenches and build rabbit houses and manage resources that could change the world. "I think, he said quietly, "that we're going to need a bigger table." The years that followed Maggie's birth brought the kind of joyful chaos that only large families could generate. Emma blossomed into a responsible teenager who balanced honors classes with her role as chief babysitter and big sister extraordinaire. Sam grew into a thoughtful 10-year-old who approached his future inheritance with the same practical seriousness he brought to rabbit care and homework, understanding that great resources meant great responsibility, but not allowing that weight to diminish his fundamental optimism. Maggie proved to be a happy, curious baby who seemed to thrive on the constant attention of her older siblings and the steady presence of parents who had learned to appreciate every ordinary moment as a gift. The foundation work continued to expand with Grace now managing programs that reached across multiple states and touched thousands of lives. Jake's training center had become a model for similar programs in rural communities, teaching practical skills while fostering the kind of self-reliance and community spirit that had always been the backbone of small-town America. But perhaps most importantly, they had achieved something that had once seemed impossible. They had created a family legacy that was defined not by wealth or tragedy, but by love and service, and the understanding that the greatest inheritances were intangible kindness, integrity, and the conviction that everyone deserved to be protected and valued and given the chance to become their best selves. On a warm evening in late spring, exactly 5 years after Grace and Sam had first appeared in his garage, Jake Morrison stood in his backyard watching his family. Emma was pushing Maggie on the swing set they'd installed the previous summer, her patient instructions about pumping legs and holding tight, delivered with the authority of someone who took her big sister responsibilities seriously. Sam was conducting an elaborate inspection of the rabbit metropolis, which had evolved into what could only be described as a small mammal city-state, complete with dedicated areas for dining recreation and what he insisted was a rabbit university. Grace emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just finished reviewing proposals for 3 new hospital wings and a groundbreaking environmental restoration project. "How's the rabbit census coming?" she asked Sam, as she set the tray on the picnic table they'd bought when Maggie started eating solid food and their kitchen table could no longer accommodate their growing family. "Population stable at 43. Sam reported with the precision he brought to all his research projects. 2 new babies last week, but the Henderson family relocated to the creek behind Mrs. Patterson's house, so the numbers balanced out. Emma called out from the swing set. "Maggie wants to know if she can pet the baby rabbits when she gets bigger. When she's old enough to be gentle and follow the safety rules." Grace replied the same answer she'd been giving to that question for the past 6 months. Jake settled into one of the lawn chairs they'd arranged around the picnic table, accepting a glass of lemonade and marveling at the ordinary miracle of it all. This was what happiness looked like, he realized, not the dramatic crescendos of movie endings, but the steady accumulation of small joys and shared responsibilities, and the deep satisfaction that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in the familiar shades of orange and pink that had marked so many of their important moments, Jake felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of something, but the full realization of something that had been growing for 5 years. A family built on choice rather than chance, love rather than obligation, and the understanding that the greatest wealth was measured not in dollars, but in moments like this. Grace settled beside him, Maggie sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Emma and Sam continued their respective projects with the absorbed concentration of children who felt secure enough to pursue their passions without fear or reservation. "Any regrets?" Grace asked quietly, her voice carrying the kind of contentment that came from asking a question to which you already knew the answer. Jake looked around at his family, at Emma, who had grown from a grieving 7-year-old into a confident teenager who carried herself with her mother's grace and her father's determination. At Sam, who had transformed from a traumatized refugee into a boy who built rabbit houses and asked thoughtful questions about wealth and responsibility. At Maggie, who would grow up knowing nothing but love and security, and the expectation that she would use whatever gifts she possessed to make the world better. And at Grace, who had taught him that second chances were possible, and that love could indeed strike twice if you were brave enough to recognize it and wise enough to nurture it. "Not a single one," he said quietly, meaning it completely. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake Morrison realized that his life had become something he'd never dared to imagine. Not just survival or even recovery, but genuine thriving. The storm that had brought Grace and Sam into his world had washed away the careful boundaries he'd built around his grief, leaving room for something infinitely better. A family that chose each other daily, a purpose that extended beyond personal survival, and the deep knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts came disguised as the most ordinary moments. The flashlight he'd grabbed that first stormy night still sat on his workbench, its beam as steady and reliable as ever. But now, instead of being just a tool for navigating darkness, it had become a symbol of something more, the understanding that sometimes when you're brave enough to step into the storm and offer light to strangers, you discover that what you're really doing is illuminating the path to your own salvation. And in the warm glow of that realization, surrounded by the voices and laughter of his family, Jake Morrison knew that his story, their story, was not an ending at all, but a beginning that would ripple forward through generations, a legacy of love and service, and the conviction that no storm was too fierce to survive when you faced it together.